so when this is posted, I think it's supposed to be posted on my birthday.
That's what you'd said.
So we figured it might as well be a big deal, and you suggested, why not doing an all-time list video, which is something I always tried to avoid because it's just kind of an impossible thing to do, like definitively. But at the same time, it's like, especially because I've seen like so much stuff from like so many different eras and so many different countries and all that, and it just seems like it would be a list like this is just kind of always constantly changing, especially with rewatches and stuff like that. Like you recently asked me if I were to ever replace what's number one on this list for me and has been for a very long time, what it might be. And the only thing I can think of is probably something if that should happen, probably something I've already seen that just hasn't been rewatched enough. It could be something that comes along that doesn't exist yet, but it just kind of seems unlikely. I'm not even sure what the newest... I think maybe the newest thing on here might be 2006. On mine, anyway. But why not at least give it a try? So even if this isn't necessarily definitive, it would probably be pretty close. Like the top 5 that I have has kind of been a definitive top 5 for me for a long time now. And just kind of like as I go-to answer when people ask you the question of what are your top favorite movies. But if you've seen like 11,000 movies like I have from so many different countries and eras and all that, it's really hard to say, and you really wonder if you're giving it enough thought when you answer a question like that. So we just kind of did the best we could with this.
I think it's also important to remember that, you know, of the movies that we mentioned, these aren't necessarily the best movies we've ever seen. These are just our favorites to put on. The way I look at it is it's my list of, you know, of all the movies that are on a movie channel, which ones am I going to stop on and watch, even though I've seen them before.
Yeah, mine's kind of a mixture of that versus what I kind of think is objectively that. So yeah, so the title might be a bit of like, it might be a little hyperbolic, just but that's basically what else will we call it. So so yeah, so were you gonna start, or
I can.
And also we do, obviously, like any other list, since I started doing them with Owen, there's the honorable mention, and then we'll do the 15.
Okay.
So what's your honorable mention?
Alright, so honorable mention of the favorite movies list. Actually, as you said, the list seems to change. This movie actually bumped another movie out and made its way in after a rethought, and I'll explain why. But the honorable mention for me is the very first Pirates of the Caribbean movie. I just think it's a good time. One of the things, I wanted to put it on my list, and one of the things that I was worried about was the fact that Jack Sparrow's shtick has run so thin that I didn't think that it would make the movie enjoyable anymore. And that's just not the case. The movie is still enjoyable. There's a lot with it. You know, there's Jeffrey Rush is a great villain. It's a fun little story. The set pieces and the action's great. The sword fighting's fun. Depp's good in it before it was, you know, run into the ground. I mean, I do think he's a big part of the reason why they kept making more movies.
Oscar nomination.
Yeah, that's always kind of really out there.
And I believe he won SAG too.
Yeah, I remember he won something big. I remember. But yeah, for me, this is just it's always been a fun movie. I liked it from the first time I saw it in the theater, and yeah, I mean, despite, you know, Johnny Depp's shtick running into the ground, I think the fact that the movie is still that enjoyable says a lot for the movie itself. It's not just a one-trick pony.
And there's so many elements to it. Whether it be like action and adventure, and then the whole swashbuckling thing, then it goes into like the ghost thing, like the curse aspect of it, and it just kind of does all that perfectly. Like I was telling you, when you said you were kind of afraid how it would hold up given the many shitty sequels it's gone. I know some people debate that, but for the most part, they're pretty shitty sequels. But when I went back and revisited all of them, I think, around the time Dead Men Tell No Tales came out, and I couldn't believe how good it still was.
Well, it crosses so many genres, too. It's an action-adventure movie, it's a comedy, it's a supernatural thriller, it's kind of horror, it's got some elements of horror. It's just kind of a jack of all trades, but Yeah, it's a. I didn't even realize that. But yeah, that's what makes it my honorable mention. So, yeah. Pirates of the Caribbean still holds up. What, 17 years later, almost.
Alright, so everything I said about the spanning multiple eras and decades and countries and all that, my honorable mention might seem like an odd choice to jump off with, but I really stand by this. It was my favorite movie as a kid for a long time, and I love how much I still love it. And that is Dick Tracy. You'll notice also a lot of these we will have talked about before, but some of them we won't have. And as you can see, I'm starting off with something I've never talked about before. So one of the things that immediately stands out about Dick Tracy is the fact that it seems overlooked in the fact of how is this not always widely considered one of the possible greatest examples ever of bringing a comic to life? Because that's exactly what it is. Like everything down to the production design, the costume design, and especially the makeup, the Oscar-winning makeup. Where you look at these people like Littleface and Pruneface and stuff like that. There's so many recognizable actors in this, and a lot of them you won't even recognize because they're just buried under the makeup. William Forsythe's flat top was something I didn't realize for a long time. It's obvious to me now.
You got Dustin Hoffman as Mumbles.
Yeah, all those characters, and they're just so it's almost hard to explain just how well he brings a comic strip to life. And Beatty himself, not just being the producer and director, but also starring as Tracy himself, where it's like you would think he's kind of bland, but that's kind of who Dick Tracy is. He's kind of the ultimate contrast to the colorful characters that he's going after. And Beatty finds a way to
kind of like Batman.
Yeah, and the fact that he that's kind of the idea that he doesn't have a lot of personality, but it's like he's not bland because he still has that sense of this is a guy who like always wins, and this is a guy who's like always gonna outsmart the villain in one way or another. And speaking of the villain, the high point of this movie, the Oscar-nominated performance by Al Pacino as Big Boy Caprice is one of my favorite things in the entire fucking world. Because he gets to do his huge, extreme, over-the-top Pacino thing in ways we've never seen before, because he's literally playing a comic book villain. It's like there is no possible way Pacino could have been too over-the-top in this. And he really goes for it. But there's also kind of those subtle things in there also when he's being calm. One of my favorite things is the running joke of him doing he's always misquoting. Mm-hmm. And that's so yeah, and just the act going as big as possible is.
I also like I had a thought. It's gone.
You know, it's like, but when he is the whole thing about the damsel in distress where he kidnaps Tess at the end and runs off with her happens to him by accident because he's being framed by Breathless posing as No-Face. And it's this whole thing where he just kind of finds himself in over his head despite the brutality we've seen. The very first time we see him, he's drowning Lips Manless in cement. And that's the thing about this, is it's both like this live action cartoon, but it's also like this really unique mob movie. Mm-hmm. With all the mob actors to go with it, like Pacino and James Caan is in there, Paul Sorvino as Lips Manless, they're all in there. And just the fact that it goes on that also, and also the way they incorporate the kid also, because the kid would usually be the type of scenario in a movie like this where you go, oh, that's where they fell short. That's the annoying part of the movie. That's where it's like, why did you have to do that? The hero doesn't need this. Well, apparently the hero does need this because they make the kid useful. They give him genuine emotional beats, and he saves Tracy's life like 3 times throughout the movie. So I really love the way they played that also. And it's the portions where we talked about how straight-faced Tracy has to be, where he does get those moments of subtle emotion through scenes with the kid. And like I said, just bringing it all to life, all the sets actually look like fake movie sets, but that's a compliment. Because that's just the style of it, and how it feels like a comic brought to life. A comic strip, mind you, brought to life.
It is a very unique looking movie.
Yeah, and the way but they still manage to get really great shots, like the cemetery scene. I love when it's revealed how shady Dick Van Dyke is. We get like the cemetery shot with like the moon in the background and Big Boy's silhouette getting closer to him. It's really amazing shit, and the way they just go as over the top as possible, knowing they're practically a live action cartoon. I love the montage of Tracy just fucking people up, where it's like there's 8 guys in front of him. With one punch, he knocks them all down. He like uppercuts that guy, and the dude does a backflip out of the frame. It's like that is the perfect tone for this kind of thing. It's really
not like when that happened in Terms of Endearment.
Yeah. And then on top of that, talking about how, you know, maybe intentionally cheesy it is, there is a shootout at the end of this movie that is massive and amazing, but it doesn't go beyond, like, it doesn't get too violent. Like, we see Flat Top get gunned down, but there's not, like, blood or anything. So it still feels like a harmless comic, even despite that. So I could go on and on about this, but this is just my honorable mention. And I could go on for days about how much I still love this movie. The score, it was just the year after Burton's Batman, and Elfman does the score for this too, and the scores are very similar. So that kind of helped with the comic booky vibe also, in the vein of where comic book movies were at that time. So yes, I still love this movie in childhood and now. So yes. It's also especially weird looking at the rest of his filmography as a director. You know, like Reds, and I guess Bulworth stands out too. So he's got a very
Bulworth's interesting.
Yeah, a very interesting filmography as a director, and that's just one gleaming example of it. So now we go into the actual list.
You can start.
Oh, you want me to do my 15?
Yeah, so then you'll do, like, we'll each do one back to back.
Alright. Hopefully this doesn't get too confusing. So my 15, I don't know how many people have seen it or know about it. I know you haven't seen it, but I'm very eager to sort of lay it down. I don't want to spoil too much, because part of doing this is I want people to seek it out if they haven't seen it. It's a movie called The Devil and Daniel Webster from 1941. Yeah. And it's obviously a story that's been told many times over. It's the whole Faust story, where the whole guy down on his luck makes a deal with the devil, becomes an asshole, has to sell his soul eventually. But the case in this is, despite the fact that the movie is called The Devil and Daniel Webster, our lead character is a guy named Jabez Stone, where he's the guy that's like really down on his luck, and he's doing his best to be a farmer, and, you know, he's got a wife, he wants to try and raise a family and do all that, but he just has constant bad luck all the time. And then he has a bag of seed that he drops into a puddle, and that's the very last straw. And he's like, I swear to God, I would sell my soul to the devil for 2 cents at this point. And like fucking that, the devil appears. And it's amazing. The devil is Walter Houston in one of my favorite performances ever. And the great thing about this movie is so incredibly atmospheric with these scenes with Walter Houston. Like, I guess you could say the movie's slip-ups would be that the scenes without Walter Houston playing Mr. Scratch, is the name he goes by, might seem very dull by comparison, but I mean, when he's there, no pun intended, the movie is on fucking fire. So he's in his barn, and when he says, I'd sell my soul to the devil, we see the barn like fill with fog, and all the farm animals start shrieking, and then he like walks out of the fog, and it's like this really, and then he like presents his business card and says, you know, I'm Mr. Scratch, and then when he says, well, I'm not interested, there's this effect that's amazing for 1941, and they barely draw attention to it. His business card just kind of disappears in a flame right in his hand, and he just kind of keeps going, and like no attention is drawn to it. And then the way he builds that up, and he says, like, you know, oh, you'll have everything you've ever wanted, but in 7 years you have to give me your soul. And of course, you know, he signs it in his own blood, and ultimately becomes a massive dick for the next 7 years, but still incredibly successful, because that's the deal. But there's also a side story going on where there's Daniel Webster, who is Edward Arnold, and he's trying to get a bid for president. So he's also potentially going to sell his soul to Mr. Scratch also. And there's this amazing shot. It's before we've actually seen Scratch's face at this point. And it's like the ultimate imagery of the devil on your shoulder, just like tenfold, where it's a shot where Edward Arnold's down here, like trying to figure stuff out on paper, and on the wall behind him is just white, and it's just a giant shadow of Scratch, like looking down on him and talking over his head. And it's this really the imagery in this movie is like, I'm not doing it justice explaining it, but I'm doing my best. And the way they use the lighting, where like everything in this movie looks so sinister, where it's like whether it's close-ups on faces or like the way rooms are lit. When he has the 2 cents in his hand that he's going to sell his soul for, it's just like this shot of like this light seemingly coming from out of nowhere, just shining down on him, and the way they light scenes like that. And then Scratch throughout the movie is basically like the shark in Jaws. He's just like everywhere. Like there's a marching band in a parade, he's in there. There's a crowd gathered around Daniel Webster, he's just hanging out in there, just kind of laughing maniacally. There's this great shot of him from a distance when Javis feels like he's being basically watched by the devil, and we just kind of see his silhouette walk into the moonlight, and just sort of waving at him, and it's just, everything is just so sinister about it. And he makes such an impression that, like, that's what I said, he basically just kind of pops up in the movie like the shark in Jaws. He made such an impression, he got an Oscar nomination in leading. And it really feels like he's not in it that much. But then there's a side plot that comes in where he brings in a girl, Belle, who seems to just materialize from hell, where she's like in front of the fireplace, and it's like this really dooming fog and brightness is coming out of it, and she just kind of appears like this spirit of sorts, and everything that she's in the vicinity of just goes horribly wrong. Like people die, she raises the son that he has, and he turns into like a hellion. There's a point in time when she's involved in this dance thing, and so everybody's like dancing at this get together of sorts. But like the way it's lit and the way it's edited and everybody's spinning around, and Scratch is in the rafters playing the violin like a fucking maniac to this. And then when it really reaches its like key moment is Javis decides he doesn't want to sell his soul, so Mr. Scratch holds him to a trial in the barn. And the jury is like ancient murderers from hell that he brings out of the ground to be the jury. The jury foreman is Benedict Arnold. The main judge is the judge during the Salem witch trials. And when he speaks, it's like, when the judge speaks, it sounds like it's distant and echoey, like really ghost-like. And it's like, and that's the thing too, is you look into this movie, and I was like, how do you put a genre on this? So I went to IMDb, and it says comedy, drama, and fantasy. For my money, this is a horror movie, through and through. But there is something darkly funny about it, for sure. But yeah, it's like one of the most atmospheric movies I've ever seen. It's easily my favorite adaptation of the whole Faust story, the deal with the devil thing, where it's like there's no better interpretation of that than Walter Houston and the way he's portrayed in this, and the way everything is lit and just looks sinister as fuck through the whole thing. I really can't recommend something like this enough. There's even, the movie even ends on a fourth wall breaking, which once again is something like, in an era like 1941 is kind of like, holy hell. Yes, I hope I made that sound appealing to a degree.
Yeah.
So that would be my 15.
Okay. Mine's going to go in another direction. Yours is a classic in every sense of the word. It's old. It's black and white. It's a groundbreaker.
And could not be in anything but black and white to accomplish that imagery.
Yeah. Yeah. I went a different route with number 15. Number 15 does involve some temptation. Does involve, a kind of a head of minions being, I guess you could say. Probably not, has a little bit of different style than Walter Houston, I'm sure. Number 15 is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. You could probably count on one hand how many people have not seen this movie at some point. Everybody knows the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
It's interesting how it's pretty much the pretty much the definition of cult movie. It's one of the absolute examples of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yet that cult has grown so much, you really wonder if it still has that title or not.
And it's one of those things, too, that when you first watch it, when it's over, you're like, what the fuck did I just see? Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's weird. There's not really much in the way of plot. But there's a lot going on for it. It looks nice. It looks very atmospheric.
A great thing about the whole lack of plot thing is you can sense that also kind of feels like, in itself, one of the many, many callbacks to the B movies. Mm-hmm. Many of which are referenced in the opening song. Mm-hmm. And just Richard O'Brien's love for them in general. Yeah.
And, the music is great. A lot of memorable songs in the movie, from start to finish. You got really young Meatloaf, really young Susan Sarandon. Barry Bostwick, Tim Curry is on another level.
Patricia Quinn, Nell Campbell, everybody, pretty much everybody.
The dude who plays Dr. Scott, can't think of his name.
Jonathan Adams.
But yeah, it's a weird little trip, kind of. It's definitely its very own animal. There's not really anything you can really compare it to. Even the follow-up that they made to it is something that's completely on the other side of the reservation. About the only thing they share in common is the two characters and the fact that it's a musical.
And anything that's ever tried to imitate it since has pretty much fallen into obscurity, and nobody knows what it is anyway. So,
yeah, exactly.
So it still stands tall above them.
It does. And I don't know, they tried to remake it with the live show. I didn't watch it, but I didn't hear good things. It's one of those movies. Now, I've seen it as a stage production myself. Back in your town, I saw it, and that was a lot of fun. It is definitely something to experience live and in a good production, especially if you have people that are passionate about it doing it. How many movies do you know that are designed to be interacted with?
Like 2.
Yeah, exactly. And this
one of which is that.
Yeah, and this one of the special features is it tells you the audience cues. There's not many movies like that, and whenever it's showing somewhere, it's an event. People dress up, people, gather around, it's a big deal. Usually midnight showings for this sell out quick. And you go, and there's no one that's, just, I'll just throw on a t-shirt and jeans and go to the movies. No, they're all decked out to the nines. They've all got their, Frankenfurter costumes, their Eddie costumes, and there's a costume for everybody. If you have that skinny friend that's comfortable with their body, there's your Frankenfurter. If you have somebody like me that's a little bit bigger and doesn't need to be seen out in public wearing something like that, there's Eddie. You can find something for everybody. But it's just a very interesting movie.
And it's funny you say that too, since the whole movie is kind of like an acceptance thing.
Mm-hmm. It is. It's about, coming to terms with ambiguous sexuality, which is huge for 1975. Because even now people struggle with that. And it's a weird little movie, and I feel like it's one of those that you're gonna love it or you're gonna hate it.
And when you do love it, you're gonna go back to it over and over and over. I was like, I don't know what this says about the way I was raised or whatever, depending on how how sheltered you are. But I was probably 12 or 13 by the time I knew the lyrics to every single song on the soundtrack, including stuff like Superheroes, the deleted songs.
Yeah. So it's definitely its own weird little animal, and I'm sure most of you have seen it and have your opinions on it. And for me, it's one of those movies that I do keep going back to. It's a good time, and there's a lot to see, and it's another one of those that you pick up on little different things in the background each time. You pick up something new. So yeah, number 15 for me is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Moving on to number 14. Number 14 was one of my favorite movies growing up. Watched it every summer. Another one that I'm sure everybody here has seen. A lot of mine are, I don't have any on my list that probably not many people have seen. Mine are all pretty popular, I think. Maybe not necessarily people's favorites, but people have seen them. But my number 14 movie is The Goonies.
Oh yeah, you'll have plenty of fellow fans for that.
Yeah. The Goonies is great. Goonies is quintessential 80s kids adventure movie. You know, you go looking for One-Eyed Willie's treasure, there's the booby traps, there's, you know, and there's all kinds of things that you remember. You know, we all had the friend that was like Mouth, and the friend that was like Data, and the friend that was like Chunk, and, you know, we all had those friends. You know, we had the friend that had the older brother like Brand, you know. All the characters are relatable, and we've seen them all before. Except maybe the Fratellis. But even then, the Fratellis are a lot of fun. Anne Ramsey's great. Robert Davi's great.
Even then, if you have a brother you can argue with a lot, you can relate to Joe Pantoliano and Robert Davi
Yeah,
throughout
you
the
can.
movie.
You can relate to the Fratelli brothers for sure. And there's a lot of funny stuff that goes on. Like the scenes with Chunk and the Fratellis are great.
Yeah, Jeff Cohen in this movie is like amazing. I was lucky enough to see this in the theater back in April.
Mm-hmm.
They just kind of played it at random. It wasn't an anniversary or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really kind of took like the actual performance that Jeff Cohen gives as Chunk, and I was like, he's actually like genuinely good in this. Mm-hmm. It's like it takes talent to be that funny, especially at that young of an age with the rest of the cast you're surrounded by.
And it starts right at the beginning with the car chase, and he gets in the window and he squeezes the drink on himself, and he's just like, oh, shit!
One of my new favorite things. I already loved it anyway, but it wasn't until somebody pointed it out, and then I definitely noticed it in the theater. Mm-hmm. When Chunk gets the ice cream away from Robert Davi, mm-hmm. and then he snatches it back, and there's that little moment where he tries to get the last bit off the spoon and takes it away, and Chunk starts crying. Just before it cuts, you can hear Richard Donner laughing next to the camera. Also, something you didn't mention is the adventure aspect. This movie has Spielberg's name. Spielberg's name is the first thing we see when this movie starts. Mm-hmm. And he brought everything people love from Raiders of the Lost Ark and basically put it in a kid's movie.
Yeah, essentially he did. I mean, the booby traps, the fact that most of it's underground.
And it's like, so in
puzzles.
In 1981, kids can watch Indiana Jones and say like, oh man, I want to be that. And then 4 years later, this comes out, and now kids get to actually see themselves in an Indiana Jones type movie.
Mm-hmm. And it's a movie that's, you know, once the adventure gets going, outside of the Fratellis, there's no adults. Sloth, you could count, I guess. Sloth in age as an adult. But
and
other than that...
The corpse.
Which one? Chester Copperpot?
The dude that they shot, that keeps showing up in Chunk's face.
Oh yeah, that's another funny thing. With the elongated yell when he's first revealed.
It becomes a running joke. He keeps running into that corpse.
Yeah. And which is a kind of a dark running joke for a kids movie.
Yeah, a lot of this is dark for a kids movie. Them running into Chester Copperpot's pretty dark.
Yeah.
And then seeing where like the whole story was actually true, where Willie basically killed everybody because they're all still there just like that. Mm-hmm. But another thing I think that's great about the movie is the way it portrays like friendship and the possibility of being separated, because the whole reason they're going on this adventure is for a pretty serious purpose.
Yeah, it's kind of their last hurrah before the... I can't really remember who's buying up the land. It has something
Troy's
to do
dad.
with... Troy's dad's buying it up to, build a golf course or something like that.
Yeah. And,
you know, it's... These guys all, Mikey gives a whole speech about it. He's like, we're going to go to different schools and see different people and everything. And I never really noticed until I saw it pointed out the other day, but the ending is really funny how... Mikey's dad just assumes that all of those jewels are going to be worth enough to save the town, and
it's like, can he really do that? That was a really rash decision.
Yeah,
he seems like a perfectly reasonable dude.
Yeah, and who's to say that Troy's dad doesn't just want to build the golf course anyway? I mean, Troy's dad's kind of a dick. I mean, Troy's a dick. It's a whole dick family. But yeah, and you have your other little moments like Mouth with Rosalita. He's translating the Spanish to the extreme and everything. It's just a fun little movie. Like you said, it's got Spielberg's fingerprints all over it. It's definitely got the Raiders vibe to
Skeletons. Spielberg loves his fucking skeletons.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird.
It's weird. It's kind of, I feel like it's kind of a mix of Raiders and Temple of Doom.
Oh, yeah.
Because it has like a Temple of Doom vibe to it, too.
Well, that would make sense. They're in the same franchise.
Yeah. But I mean, because I feel like there's a little bit of a different tone with Temple of Doom even than there was with Raiders of the Lost Ark, which we'd already talked about Indiana Jones. So I mean, you can go back and look at that. But yeah, it's a fun little movie. Chris Columbus wrote it, which is really interesting. There's a lot of big names involved with it.
Yeah, Chris Columbus wrote it and Gremlins, like one right after the other.
Richard Donner directed it. It's a movie that's got a lot of big names attached to it.
They got bigger.
Yeah.
Much bigger. And I love that Brolin like is still, no matter how big he gets, because I think he's the one that's really taken off the most lately, especially.
For a while there, Sean Astin had it going, and then
like
Lord of the Rings ended, and then now I just saw a commercial the other day where he's dressed as Colonel Sanders in like a sequel to Rudy. Have you not seen this? You may have to YouTube this.
But the fact that like everybody that was in this movie still holds it in high regard because they always come back for like the conventions and stuff. So that's the commentary on this DVD is like legendary at this point.
Yeah, but it's just a really fun kids adventure, and it's if you grew up with it, it's going to be a favorite for you. That's how it worked out for me. Had I seen it, for the first time yesterday as opposed to when I was a kid, probably wouldn't hold the same meaning. It'd just be another standard kids adventure movie. But when you grow up with it, it changes everything.
Yeah, interestingly enough, as universal as it seems, there are some people that just never got attached. When I saw it in the theater, there was a girl next to me who was probably like 15 or so, and the movie ended, the pirate ship comes out, and the amazing ending, and then the credits roll, and I heard this girl turn to the people she was with, and she's like, well, I gave it a second chance. And it's like, apparently she's not a fan. So yeah, I think Owen said that he doesn't care for it either. So
you find some out there that don't, and it's okay. But I mean, it's a movie that if you're passionate about it, I mean, it's easy to find.
It's one of those cases where you're like, it's okay if people feel that way, but at the same time, it's like, I have trouble figuring out why because I can't. Also, fun fact: the Cher movie Burlesque, directed by the guy that plays Troy.
Oh, interesting.
It's random as hell, isn't it? My number 14 is pretty topical, given the time of year this should be posted.
This actually was very close to making my list as well.
Yeah.
This was the only time that we almost repeat. Spoiler: we don't repeat.
Yeah. It's Halloween. So not only is this, I'm pretty sure, my favorite horror movie, if I don't contradict that later in this list, I don't think I do. This is one of those movies that takes the simplest concept and made one of the scariest movies of all time, if not depending on who you talk to. There are a few movies considered the scariest of all time. At least two of those is Carpenter, which of course that score is composed by him. And then I remember this is one of those movies where I'll always remember the first time I saw it. It was when me and you went to Hollywood Video repeatedly and got one movie at a time with all the horror franchises, this, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, all those. And I watched this way early in the morning. It was like 7 o'clock in the morning, and the opening still freaked me out. And it's where we see the whole everything from the point of view, and then we see the murder, and then it's ultimately revealed that it is an emotionless child doing this. And that's immediately followed by the scene where Loomis, Donald Pleasance, goes to the hospital.
Who's fantastic in this movie.
Yeah, like really convinces you of the evil that Michael is before we even really get a look at it. In this scene when they're driving in the rain, and just that shot of them pulling up and seeing the inmates like walking around aimlessly in the rain.
It's very unsettling.
Yeah, which ultimately ends up being Michael's escape.
Which they tried to recreate in the newest version with the bus accident.
Yeah. And this is also like it's the kind of tradition of watching it every Halloween. This year right now will be the first year that I watch it and David Gordon Green's movie back to back, and I'm curious how that goes. But yeah, talking about the way Loomis built up that evil and then the way it's portrayed to us. because after that scene, a lot of this movie, like a very large portion of this movie, is set during the day. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, where it's like you could watch it.
It's all in the same day, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, once we get past Michael escaping, and then it's daytime, and then from that day, and then all the way to through the second movie, the second movie.
Yeah.
One of three. But yeah, and one of the things I really love about this is one of the things that's really gone to hell about horror movies lately is their score being overbearing. And I love that this movie does the exact opposite. Yeah, it has the jump scare sound when like the kid picking on Toby runs into him, and when he stands up and watches them go inside. But then there's moments like when Laurie's walking to the Myers house, and there's one there too when he like pops up. But when we first get to the Myers house, the score is going as she's walking, and when she gets to the Myers house, it stops completely. It doesn't get bigger. It doesn't have a big beat.
It just quits.
It just stops. And I just love that. And there's stuff like that throughout the entire movie. And it really goes against that whole thing of the during the day you're safe thing. Michael's there behind the bush during the day. He's hanging out with the laundry during the day. And he just stalks. He's outside the school during the day. And because it's Halloween, just nobody thinks anything of a dude in a mask.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing about this movie also is the fact that it is just a guy in a mask. So when it's doing the stuff that's horror cliches now that may not necessarily been in 78, like the idea that when she tries to kill him throughout the climax, he suddenly can't die. It's like that's just a cliche now that people are tired of. And it's like, they're just like, God, why won't he die? But you think, when this movie came out in 78, that wasn't a cliche, and people were like, it's just a guy in a mask and that's all it is. So when he keeps fucking sitting up and coming back, it's fucking terrifying, because we don't know how or why.
And the movie doesn't even end with a satisfying conclusion to him.
Yeah.
The body's gone, and it's just like, well, that's the story. Thanks for coming.
It also set up the thing where the killers...
He could be in your yard. Have fun.
When the killer sets up the bodies for the final girl to just see all at once. He's got the body laid out in his fucking sister's tombstone in the bed. It's a terrifying ending. And like I said, it may, for some people, seem watered down because everything in it is a cliche now. But
well, not only that, but it has the same issue that Pirates of the Caribbean essentially had, was, does it still hold up after the sequels have tried to kill it?
And there's been a couple of reboots since then. And a lot of retconning.
Yeah.
But
although I did find the newest one very enjoyable. It's probably my second favorite after this one.
Yeah, I still stand by. I think H2O is really underrated. But at the same time also...
Either way, we need some Jamie Lee Curtis to make these sequels work.
Yeah, because I mean, if you want to talk like iconic performances, or even iconic screams, she like created the whole Scream Queen thing. I mean, you can go back to Fay Wray, obviously, but I mean, as far as it really taking off as a thing that people like knew and like made a thing, that's where we are. And also,
and she was kind of the like.
She got it from her mom, Psycho, of course.
Yeah, but I
Janet
mean,
Leigh. Sounds like I was calling Janet Leigh Psycho.
Yeah. But I mean, she's also one of the ones that's. I mean, if you take out the middle ones and Resurrection, she's one of the ones that's lasted the longest in a series.
Yeah.
Of movies like that. Like normally, like every Friday the 13th, it's a new set of kids next sequel.
What's great about her also is when you see her as like the final girl at the end, is she's just so normal through most of the movie when she's being a babysitter. And that's the thing too, is the whole opening, when it's still daytime, that's what makes the second half so scary, is they pretty much make the characters feel as real as possible. They might seem like types that are just here to die, but I mean, they're still, you know, teenage girls just walking home from school, and it's still fall. The way it portrays fall, it's like you can smell fall through the screen when you watch this movie.
Yeah.
And just really sets you in that real area for the first half, and then when shit starts going down in the second half, when he's killing dogs and eating them and shit, and when he's starting to take them out one by one. And there's really not a lot of, you know, on-screen stuff. Like, it's mostly strangulations, weirdly enough, despite how famous the knife is. But
It's kind of like Texas Chainsaw in that way.
yeah.
Where Texas Chainsaw, you don't really see anything.
Yeah, and he, like, uses everything but a chainsaw for a long time. So yeah, probably the most well-crafted horror movie in my mind. I know some people go to another Carpenter movie like The Thing, but for me it's always been Halloween. And like, just to take something so simple and make a movie so terrifying through camera tricks and just really great
It's a
movie
very
making.
simple concept too. Like, masked dude at Halloween killed people. It's very...
So yeah, and yet somehow helped create, because there's a lot of origins to this genre for sure, the slasher genre, but this definitely sort of started a new era. So yeah, so that would be what my 14 is. So it's my go again, yeah. So 13. 13, we're still kind of in the area of serial killers. But this isn't one of the cases, and we'll come to this again in mine, is it's what obviously being on this list means it's my favorite movie by a certain director. And it may not be an obvious choice, yet it is the own director himself's choice of his own movies. So I feel kind of, and I made that decision before I knew that, like way back in the day when I first saw this, because this was a love at first sight movie for me. I was like so proud of the idea that both me and him thought it was his best movie. I'm of course talking about Hitchcock, which means I'm talking about Shadow of a Doubt. This is another movie that kind of has different sort of like actual remakes and like loose remakes, like Stoker from a few years ago with Mia Wasikowska and Matthew Good and Kidman is pretty much a remake of this. But there's, like I said, it was really just kind of a love at first sight movie, and one of the things about it that really stood out was Joseph Gordon. And the thing about that was, this is the first movie I saw him in. Because when you go and you look at some of the comments on this movie, they're like, oh, when you look at the rest of his roles, like Joseph Gordon was the perfect casting choice for this. It's like, you so don't suspect him to be a killer. It's like, I saw this before I saw The Third Man, or Citizen Kane, or The Magnificent Ambersons, or any of his other movies. So this is how I knew him. But just immediately, I thought he was playing that perfectly. And what I love about Uncle Charlie, his character, is when you look at the rest of the threats in Hitchcock movies, and why he's scarier than all of them. Because you've got Norman Bates, who's a fucking weirdo out in the middle of nowhere. I know there's so much subtlety I've talked about previously in another video what Anthony Perkins did with that, and the Norman Bates character in general. Still weirdo out in the middle of nowhere. Then you got Lars Thorwald from Rear Window, your neighbor. It's like, yeah, creepy weirdo in the middle of nowhere could be a killer, your next door neighbor could be a killer. Or there is Bruno Anthony in Strangers on a Train, where it's like the friendly stranger you just meet in public could be a serial killer. It's like all those have their stance here. Uncle Charlie is a beloved family member. That makes him scarier than all the other people I mentioned. Because not only, when I say beloved family member, our other lead character, Teresa Wright, playing young Charlie, she named herself after him. Her name is Charlotte, but they're all like, oh, you're young Charlie because you and Uncle Charlie are like the greatest thing ever. To the point that she believes they're connected telepathically. There's even the point in time where when we first see him, his introductory shot is laying in bed, and it's like the way the camera moves. And when we're introduced to her, it's the exact same shot, and she's in the exact same position on her bed. And it's like they're connected in that way, and she's just like obsessed with the idea that he is the greatest thing ever. It's like we have an Uncle Mike that's one of the greatest dudes ever. The concept of this movie for us would be if Uncle Mike was a serial killer. And you can't wrap your head around that. You would never be able to wrap your head around that.
Or
and then,
Jeff.
Yeah, I thought that too. And then like the way that's slowly revealed to her, and like how, and the repercussions of that is how this movie unfolds. And you just really, so yeah, and also it's this whole thing of being set in like the perfect town. Like a whole portion of the movie is practically a satire on like the perfect, suburban town.
Stepford Wives town.
Yeah, where everybody knows like everybody's name and everything. It's got like the cop that's directing traffic that knows who you are all the time.
Have a nice day, Billy.
And it's a classic case of a stranger just being in the absolute wrong place. But the difference is that this is the place that the stranger grew up in, so he's not a stranger at all. Mm-hmm. Even though he is in mind. Like, he does not fucking belong here at all. But at the same time, he is so... usually in cases like this, the stranger feels out of place, and it's like, oh, the people around me. Charlie is hell-bent on not leaving. He wants to stay here forever and wreak havoc on old ladies and strangle them. And he's even being followed by like these bumbling detectives that have like followed him across the country, even though they don't know what the hell he looks like. And stuff like that, but it's like they still know just enough for there to be a lot of suspense in these scenes. I still get creeped out by the scene of Charlie approaching the house and we see him through the curtains. And it's like, because we know pretty much who he is when nobody else does. Mm-hmm. And the cops can't just say, oh, that's who we're looking for, because they don't know what he looks like. But just that shot like tells us everything. Yeah. And there's stuff like that throughout it also. But then there's also some comedy relief. They've got like a family friend that lives next door, played by Hugh Cronin. I think this was his first movie. And this also, it's comedy relief, but it also builds suspense at the same time, which is great. Where he's having constant conversations with their dad about how you could get away with murder. And they try to think about how you do stuff like that. So it's like, at one point he gives him like coffee, and then he's like, why, what's different about it? And he's like, I put soda in it. Just enough soda as I would poison if you were, and you didn't even taste it. So haha, you'd be dead. And they have conversations like that just for fun. But Charlie is present, and Charlie, who's keeping this secret, has to watch people joke about, this is how I get away with murder. And you can sense the discomfort forming, and like any minute now some facade's going to drop. Mm-hmm. And you're just kind of waiting for it.
They're making a joke out of something that's a passion for him. Yeah.
And then the way they go back and forth, once young Charlie starts to figure it out, where like he starts trying to kill her in these sloppy yet elaborate ways, and then she'll strike back by saying like, hey, did you forget you gave me a key piece of evidence like this ring? And it just kind of goes back and forth. And then there's the case of when he hides the newspaper. But it's talking about the Merry Widow killer, and she figures it out though, and she's like, oh, I know, I saw that, you're hiding the paper, you don't want us to see what's in there, you're hiding something. But it's not till way later she realizes what it is. But the fact that she figured it out that quickly, without figuring it out, it's like it just leaves those threads in there where it's almost there, and just leaves you waiting for that. And like you were talking about his passion for it, when we finally get the big scene where the facade drops and he describes basically why he kills old women, and basically the fact that he finds them useless. Mm-hmm. And it's just like this really impassioned monologue about why he kills, and it's insane. And then of course this ultimately leads to a confrontation, and really it's just the build-up, the characters, all this stuff is just like pure Hitchcock in the best way. One of his, unfortunately, most overlooked movies, but I'm so glad that he sees it. He saw it as like his best movie or his favorite movie of his own. So yeah, so that was just, like I said, just a love at first sight movie. I know I love, like, I do think Psycho's a perfect movie. I do think Rear Window's a perfect movie. Vertigo would be up there. Strangers on a Train would be up there. So many. But if I had to pick one, this is the one that like I've always been drawn to. So that's how I feel about that one. Okay. So now we're on your 13?
Yes. My number 13, another movie that I think everybody has seen. I don't know very many people that haven't. But my number 13 is the first Ghostbusters. It's funnier than hell. The three guys together are hilarious. There's so many little moments. The commercial
you just gonna
comes
snub
to
Winston?
mind. We'll get to Winston.
Okay.
But I mean, the chemistry between the three leads is just great. They're almost like, they almost feel like brothers.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Do they ever? I can't remember. Do they ever actually refer to themselves as brothers? I don't think they do.
It's probably close enough.
Yeah, I think it's just understood. And then Winston comes in, and Winston kind of holds his own, but Winston never gets he doesn't blend as well, but he does come in later.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's just so much. This is another movie that could fall into different genres. It could fall into comedy. It could fall into sci-fi. It could fall into horror.
Yeah, because some of it's genuinely creepy, especially at the start there, and the score.
The very first scene is pretty scary. When Ray Finkel's mom is at the library working, and she gets scared, and we don't see what it is, and the movie just starts, and it has like this happy little upbeat theme song, and you know, we're building these guys that are funny, and then we go back to the library, and everything gets kind of dark and sinister again.
You kind of don't expect, because of the way it's portrayed in the opening scene, we kind of don't expect to see the ghost the way we do. It's almost abrupt. And it like catches you off guard. It's kind of genuinely creepy.
Yeah. And what's funny is, like, they go in there, they're all excited, and they're ready to do their study, and they're going to be proven right, and they go in, and they just totally puss out. Like, they just...
It's always Ray's fault.
It is. It is. Poor Ray. But there's so many great things going on in this movie. Rick Moranis is great in this movie as like the pesky neighbor that wants to get in Sigourney Weaver's pants, and just even the hint of a threat, and he's all over it. Especially when that first scene when he sees Venkman leaving the apartment, and he just looks at him like
as if he's a threat.
Yeah, as if Lewis is gonna take down Venkman. Sigourney Weaver's great in this.
Especially when she's possessed.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she was painted as such a badass as Ripley, and in this movie she's not really a badass. She becomes that way when she's possessed.
Yeah, this was kind of between Ripley badassness, because it was between Alien and Aliens.
Yeah, and for me the hero of this movie is Harold Ramis. Harold Ramis kills me every time. Just the way he says things and the way he looks, and like in the commercial where he looks at his mark and steps forward and then looks at his mark and steps back, like he does everything so precisely.
I think my favorite line is still when they're in the hotel and they're still trying to figure everything out. And Ray's like, "Whatever you do, don't look at the trap." I looked at the trap, right? as he's looking at it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of memorable things with this. Everybody remembers Walter Peck, the asshole that was right, that just went about it the wrong way, which is the story of William Atherton's career. I mean, in Die Hard he was kind of a shady asshole, but in Biodome he was an asshole, but he went about it the wrong way. But he was ultimately right. They fucked everything up. But you have the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, you have Gozer, you have all the lines, you know, the cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria.
It feels like...
Go get her, Ray.
It feels like almost every scene has something iconic in it.
It does. It's a very iconic movie, and it's another one of those where everybody and their brother has seen it. And most people... I don't know too many people, if any, that don't enjoy this movie. At least in some aspect.
Not to mention there's also interesting passion behind it when you look at the fact that Aykroyd co-wrote it with Harold Ramis. And I'm not sure about Harold Ramis for sure, but Aykroyd is like really passionate about the supernatural in general. And so it's like you see this as a comedy, but this is also stuff he takes like really seriously.
It's like a passion project for him.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's great. And I love that our leads, like, they're shitty people. I mean, the beginning at the hotel, whenever they first bust them, and they have no idea what to charge. Egon's like feeding little hints with his fingers. And they're just pulling numbers out of their ass. And Venkman's a dick to everyone, and including Walter Peck, which drives Walter Peck insane. Brings him to his point. They smoke, they curse, they're swindling the college they work for out of money. Hell, the movie opens with Venkman shocking a guy for fun because he thinks the girl sitting next to him's hot. Like, they're not good guys. But we still root for them. We still have fun with them. It's just a movie that from start to finish, like you said, there's not more than 10 minutes of screen time that goes by before something iconic happens to everybody.
It always
everybody can know and draw back to it.
It always kind of bugged me that guy never insisted Venkman turn her cards around the way he turned his around.
Yeah. Yeah, the dude just gets flustered. I don't have to do this. And then Venkman drops isn't it like only 78 more to go or something like that? Or 75 or something like that.
He got one right, too.
Yeah, and Venkman was just like, no, care. He couldn't even give him that. Yeah, the sequel really does kind of take it down a peg. There's still some funny stuff in there. When they are measuring the girl with the puppy, and the scene ends with just Egon going, now let's take away the puppy, and you're like, good lord.
That girl, by the way, is Catherine Reitman, the daughter of Ivan Reitman.
Oh, really?
And sister of Jason. She does, like, I think it's like YouTube stuff or something now.
Oh, okay.
She's some sort of comedian.
But yeah, Ghostbusters is a lot of fun. Just rewatched it recently. Holds up. It always will hold up.
Yeah, and I'll stand by 2. I stand by 2 pretty comfortably as well.
If you want to know what I thought of the 2016 remake, I think it's fine. I don't think it's earth shattering. I don't think it's world busting.
I refuse to criticize Kate McKinnon, so you can't ask me.
I think the ending's very creative with the ghost in the street. I found that to be creative.
The way it's like the ghost of an entire city, I thought was a really cool idea.
Yeah, it did have some cool ideas, and the one in 2020, we'll see. We'll see what happens. But yeah, Ghostbusters, a lot of fun. Always can go back and rewatch Ghostbusters. And always find something fun to enjoy. So moving on, that brings us to what, number 12? Okay, number 12 for me, short and sweet. It's Boondock Saints. Boondock Saints was a movie that I first saw in college.
Of course.
Another one of those movies, it's just one of those ones like the first time you watch it's in college. It's interesting. It's a different experience. It does, when you first watch it, it does kind of feel like a Tarantino ripoff. It does. But there's a lot of things that it has going for it. Norman Reedus and Sean Patrick Flannery as the twins are great. They have really good chemistry. They definitely have that brotherly chemistry where they kind of pick on each other. There's the scene during the opening credits when they're hitting each other in the meat factory with large pieces of meat. David DeLaRocco is a lot of fun. He's kind of the loudmouth, but he's got some fun stuff. Like the scene where he accidentally shoots the cat is funny, but as a cat owner, it does kind of hurt to see.
He's definitely his own character.
Yeah, he is. He is. And he's essentially playing... He's not playing himself, but the character is the same name as him. Yeah. And Willem Dafoe is just on another level in this movie. Like, Willem Dafoe just brings it. Like, he doesn't... He brings his A game to this, and he does a lot of things that we don't think of when we think of Willem Dafoe. We don't think of Willem Dafoe, sleeping with another guy and cross-dressing and...
But then again, Willem Dafoe is an actor that will go in... You've never seen a Lars von Trier movie.
No, I haven't.
There's no place Willem won't go.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. But yeah, Willem is fantastic in this movie. He's great. The movie itself is a lot of fun.
Yeah,
you definitely got to put up with a lot of language and a lot of violence. It's definitely a violent and angry movie. I mean, the bartender in the first 5 minutes has some sort of, I don't know if it's supposed to be Tourette's or what, but he just yells fucking ass repeatedly.
It may not be Tourette's, but it's movie Tourette's.
Yeah, it is. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, because I was telling you that I kind of thought it would be one of those movies, sort of like the way I went into Donnie Darko again.
Mm-hmm.
I avoided it for a long time, watching it again, because I wasn't sure if it was going to be one of those, I really love it as a teenager and think it's brilliant, and then I grow out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, honestly, I was kind of genuinely surprised when I got this Blu-ray, and then I went back and watched it, and I was like, damn, this is still really good.
Yeah, it's really neat.
And interesting fact that sort of brings us full circle.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I heard about this movie was at Owen's place, and it had been rented by the guy that played Frankenfurter in the production of Rocky Horror you were just talking about.
That's right, yeah. So yeah, there's Billy Connolly's really good in it.
Such an inspired casting choice. Like,
Yeah.
what the hell?
Yeah, it's
Yet it works.
It does.
He's so threatening.
Yeah.
When they bring him out.
He is. It's crazy.
It's like the last Billy Conway movie I talked about was Gulliver's Travels.
And I think the scenes are really cool when Willem is breaking apart the crime scenes.
Oh yeah.
Breaking them down, how it's told that way.
Yeah, that's like the movie's high points.
Yeah, that's kind of what it's known for. And the way that it's done in that style, that would be an easy style to imitate, that you could imitate it and it still wouldn't be, quite as good as what happened. And I think that's what helps set it apart. I think if we didn't have stuff like that, we didn't have as high caliber of acting coming into it and performances, yeah, it could have easily been labeled a Tarantino ripoff and forgotten about. But it does enough to stand on its own. It's a great, enjoyable rewatch. It's, like I said, it's potty mouth and violence central, but it's a damn good time.
Avoid the sequel at all costs.
I have not seen it. It's been on Netflix for months, and I don't care to watch it.
Good. Julie Benz, what the fuck were you thinking? Alright, my number 12 is different. It's also a movie I talked about very recently to great extent, so there's not really much else I can say I haven't already. So I'll just kind of touch on the basics of that. My number 12 is Elephant, where I recently did a video, I guess it would have been last summer, on Gus Van Sant's Death Trilogy, which this is the middle piece of. And it got an interesting reaction. It did win the Palm at Cannes, but at the same time there were a lot of people who thought it was very pointless, didn't know what Van Sant was trying to say. It was obviously some sort of answer to Columbine, but they didn't know exactly what. And basically the main thing I take away from it, without going into it for another half hour like I did before, is it's basically just showing us the intersecting lives of these kids in a random high school day. Not intersecting stories, just intersecting people. And that's all it really needs to do. To just kind of show the mundane high school life before this really big event happened. And it's intersected to the point, and like the timeline keeps matching up to the point that we never miss a moment of what happens in this day leading up to that. And it's a moment that's introduced to us pretty early, like the start of it. So once it turns into the mundane, it quickly turns into us waiting to see what's going to happen when that moment hits, because just as we're always getting close to it, the timeline reverts back and we follow somebody else, and we kind of keep coming back at the same head.
It's like it's coming, and you know that horribleness is going to go down, and you just kind of want it to get there so you can get through it.
Yeah, so it's almost like it's torturing you with how much it bides at the time and shows us all the characters, but it's also building us to that point by showing us the killer's perspective, both of them. But we don't really get inside their heads, which I think pissed a lot of people off when it came out, because they thought that would be the purpose of making a movie like this. But Van Sant's not really interested in the why aspect of it, and what I concluded in my last video was that there's just too many whys to even try. And you can look at that with when that stuff happens today, too. It's like you see the media just constantly going, but why? And they try to dissect it. And it's like, most of the time, there isn't one. Or one worth getting to the bottom of. And so it's really just a movie of observing and just showing us the event itself.
Is this the same Diane Keaton I'm thinking of? It was the executive producer?
Yeah.
Oh.
That's random, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And we kind of see it for a while through the perspective of John, the character pictured on the front. Which I think is really interesting, because John's one of those people where the movie doesn't really... It shows us the types, but the interesting thing about the character John is he's the guy kind of like... Probably like you were, where you weren't in a specific group. You were just kind of... Just like everybody knew you, and there's not much particular like clique or anything you're a part of, just a guy that flows through it all. And to kind of start the movie at his perspective, I think kind of shows this whole sort of neutral thing in regards to the way it's showing it to us. And then when it gets to that point, the fact that there's like nothing glorified about it. Just like it doesn't glorify high school the way a movie would, just as it doesn't glorify the violence the way it does either. It's just really, just everything feels like painfully realistic. And like it's showing off like the lack of ceremony in all these people's final moments. Because that's basically what the movie is once we realize what's going on. It's so mundane, but it's also the last moments of many of these people's lives, or the last moments before their lives were altered forever. Like, even if they weren't killed, this event is going to stay with them forever. Like, somebody like John, who gets out of the building in time, he's still not going to be the same because a lot of these people were his friends. These are people that he passed in the halls. Like I said, I love the way they introduce the characters when he, like, runs into Eli in the hall. And it's like just through like little introductions that don't really tell us anything. When you see those two together, you're like, yeah, those two would hang out. Those guys know each other. I just feel that. And that's just basically what the movie does until it gets to what happens, and then it's like...
Which is crazy, because you would think that the way you're describing this, that it would take a while for all of this to happen. And I can tell by the back of the box here, the movie is 80 minutes.
Yeah, and it barely feels like that, especially the more you see it. And that's the thing, too, is it's such like a harrowing, disturbing movie, but it's a movie I go back to so many times because it's just the way it observes is so engrossing, and like just how ballsy it is that that's all it does is observes. It doesn't want to say anything particular commentary wise or anything like that.
It's just a fly on the wall.
Yeah, that's it, and that's all you need to make like a really...
It literally is just saying, yeah, this happened.
Yeah,
I don't have an opinion on it. It just happened.
So that's... And so, yeah, but like I said, any further thoughts on that? I talked about it for like a whole half hour in a video last summer. So there's more of that, where I talked about the whole Death trilogy that Van Sant did. But yes, absolutely always been one of my favorite movies. My number 11 is a movie that is... I've gone through some maybe not so popular movies here. This one's pretty popular.
Yeah, it is.
And a movie I love so much. Somehow, someway, a movie I haven't talked about on here yet. But really, and it's one of those movies also where I always loved it and I always watched it, but for some reason it never dawned on me until for a long time that it's a masterpiece. It just kind of occurred to me one day, and it's like, yeah, this movie's fucking perfect. There is not a flaw in it. I'm talking about Sling Blade. This is
biscuits and mustard.
This is, yeah, that. The fact that he created this iconic character where you just hear a few words like that that seem really out of context, but you know exactly who the character is.
You don't even need the words, you just need the...
Yeah. I mean, that is like amazing character work. And have you heard how Carl came to be, how this whole movie came to be? The story I heard was he was doing some shitty movie or something, and he had a really bad haircut and like a really bad costume, and he was just trying to come to terms with it. He was just looking in the bathroom mirror and seeing his haircut and his costume. He just did that face and did that voice, and the whole giant monologue he has at the very first scene of the movie, he just said right there, like the whole thing just came to him in the mirror like that. And then he like wrote it down and made it like a short, and then adapted that into this feature-length thing. And that face he's making, he can do that. That is not prosthetics, which is still amazing to me. And you can actually see sometimes him like just go into it. He says he tries to do it rarely, especially because it's physically painful. But to actually see him do it is like, he did it as like an occasional thing on Inside the Actors Studio. There's an outtake on the Ice Harvest where he did it. And it's just crazy to see him just morph into Carl like that, because he can just do it on the spot like that. And it turns into, I don't know how many people will even disagree with me on this. I don't imagine many. An all-time great performance. Like, it's got to be up there with one of the best performances ever in any category by any actor. And the fact that they use, sort of in the vein of like Forrest Gump or Rain Man, I guess you could say, the fact that a lot of the way Carl doesn't understand the world is played for comedy, but not necessarily in like an offensive way. Because Carl is also like, even though he's seemingly the way he is through the eyes of characters like Doyle, he's still like extremely...
You spit that name with such hate.
Oh god.
Doyle.
Fucking Doyle. We'll talk about Doyle. But the thing about Carl is that the reason that works, this kind of goes into the Robert Downey Jr. speech in Tropic Thunder, where you got to have more to it. You can't just do it on a surface level. So we can laugh at Carl for some of the misunderstandings he has about the world, but there's also many scenes that show us he's like really quietly observant. And like, there are certain things that he knows just enough about to be able to do and make the right decisions, or maybe make the decision that might be wrong but right in the long run to an extent. to where he recognizes a moral dilemma and makes the decision he's going to make. And there's like so much deep character work in that for a character that seems like he could be just sort of laughed at on the surface. But he does have fun with also making the character kind of like that. So it's also funny to me, they play this up kind of in both ways in the scene where he has lunch with John Ritter. When he has lunch with Vaughn and he's talking about, Vaughn's like kind of observing him and he's saying like, you know, Carl, when I look at you, I see you as a really deep thinker. And he's like, what are you thinking right now? And his response is, I'd like to take these taters home with me. But it's like, that's the payoff to that. Is it's like, oh, he's not a thinker at all, he's thinking about potatoes. But Vaughn is right. In that Carl is always kind of thinking and taking stuff in. He's just not always understanding it, and is not always in the right moment to... Like, those things he observes will come back to him in the right moments, and he will make decisions based on that, regardless of his character. And the way the movie's made is genius, because Thornton obviously not only wrote it, but directed it also, and his direction is flawless in this. There are so many, like, subtle long takes. And they're not flashy long takes, they're the long takes where the camera just sits in one place. And so much action and involving stuff happens in the shot, you don't even realize you've been watching a tape that's like 10 minutes long with no cuts. And just all the dramas in it at once. There's a lot of that, and that stuff like that also really helps the pacing. I always forget this movie is like 2.5 hours, because it doesn't feel like it at all. That opening scene alone, like with him getting interviewed and the build-up to the interview and all that, and him finally getting released, is like nearly 20 minutes long before we see the title of the movie. And you never feel that. And then you see all of like the really real characters throughout this movie. You see like the guys he works with that make the jokes and stuff like that. And it just feels like you're observing real people in real environments. And that also comes through with performances like Dwight Yoakam as Doyle. And Doyle is so realistically terrifying. Dwight Yoakam, I think, plays one of the most convincing movie villains ever. Because I feel like we never quite grew up with a Doyle, but we grew up with kids that had a Doyle. And it's just so, like, I get so much fucking anxiety every time Dwight Yoakam is on screen in this movie, which is really interesting, because he pretty much never played a role like this again. He played bad guys from time to time, but never to...
homicide!
But never to this extent that felt so real, and just visceral in how much you could hate them and how much they clearly hate the world around them, and will take it out on everybody because they're a drunk piece of shit. And just abusive for the sake of it. Whether it be a small, subtle way or in a really big, physical way. Just everything about this guy just oozes, fuck this guy. And that comes through in such a real way. Even down to the point that the way Linda feels trapped in their relationship. Like the fact that he's buddy-buddy with the cops. So when he says stuff like, if you leave me, I'll kill you, she really has no option. And we actually, like, he can say, like, I know the cops, like, there's the scene with the band where the neighbor's yelling at him, and he's like, I play cards with J.D. Shellnut, chief of police. But then, right after that, we see him interact with the guy. They, like, discuss drunk driving in jest to the cops and then speed off. That's how much power he has. The cops are useless in this scenario. They are stuck with Doyle no matter what. And the way that ties into Carl's story is just this really beautiful full circle thing. Like, this movie is so airtight in how it gets from point A to point B and why things need to happen the way they do and what their result is. And like I said, that 2.5 hours is just full of this really realistic character stuff. John Ritter's amazing in this. Like, his character's like so believably sensitive and stuff like that. And the way Carl like describes his past when he talks about like when he killed his mom and her lover, when he had to bury his baby brother alive because Robert Duvall didn't want him. And it's like, these are scenes that are so vivid in the way they're explained, you almost forget we don't actually see them. But you remember them vividly the way he describes them and the visual that's in your head when you hear that. And that goes a long way. And Robert Duvall, too, that whole thing where Carl finally confronts his dad after a situation like that. And we just see that he's like a feeble man at this point, doesn't even know where the hell he is. It's just really, really powerful scenes, one right after the other. And the relationship between him and Lucas Black, Frank, is just this really sort of beautiful relationship. When it gets to the inevitable end, when he has to leave, and he gets his individual goodbye with everybody, whether it be the goodbye with Linda or Frank or Vaughn, especially with Vaughn when he's talking about, like, when he fully understands the position Frank is in and the kind of kid that he is, like, it gets to me, like, every time. And then there's, like, I really love the continuous thing of the last thing everybody says to him is calling out his name, where it's like he walks away from Linda and she calls his name, and then he walks away from Frank and he calls his name, he walks away from Vaughn and Vaughn calls his name, and then his name is the last thing Doyle says before he kills him. Like in the exact same tone, all four of them. And it's just perfect. And like I said, coming full circle, the book end with J.T. Walsh. And it just kind of shows the way he's changed, but also not changed. How he's got a new story, but all of his old stories are still there. And it's just this, yeah, like I said, this really clean-cut story that just kind of faces the music head-on. And once again, I don't know how much time we're gone into, but there's so many great things to say about it, but that's just a few of them. So, yeah. So now we're on your 11?
My 11 is, judging by the look of this list, is my favorite suspense film of all time. Another one that's popular. Everyone's seen it. We've actually talked about it before, so we won't take too long on this one. But my number 11 is The Silence of the Lambs.
We just drove by one of the filming locations today.
Yeah, we drove by the building where Lecter kills Charles Napier. What can you say about Silence of the Lambs that we didn't say before? It's atmospheric as hell. Hopkins is brilliant. Foster's brilliant. Scott Glenn's brilliant. Tracy Walter's brilliant. You could just say everybody in this movie is brilliant.
Of course, Ted Levine.
Ted Levine. What I will say about this movie that I don't think we really touched on before is I'll spend on Ted Levine. With all of the great performances in this movie, and all the ones that are talked about, Ted Levine is criminally left out of those conversations. Ted Levine is a fucking freak. And he's great. He's so great in this movie.
It's sort of the Dwight Yoakam as Doyle scenario, and he really never played a part like this again. He played some weirdos. The Warden in Shutter Island's pretty creepy, and he's the voice of Rusty Nail in Joyride. But to this extent.
And in the other movie, he's kind of just an asshole. I mean, that's kind of the furthest he goes. Like
usually asshole cops.
Yeah. Or
interestingly
Evolution, asshole general. On Monk, he's a cop. I don't know if he's an asshole or not. But he's
we'll chalk that up to probably.
Yeah. But he's just so good in this. He's so convincing and real and just fucked in the head.
And it could have been a real caricature of sort of that crazy villain also, but it's because the material goes so above and beyond.
And it's interesting too because the way that he plays it and the way that he's portrayed, he is somebody that Hannibal Lecter would have an interest in. Like, if it went too over the top, you know, you could see a character like Lecter saying, oh, this guy's silly, why do I give a shit? You know, in his little fancy, you know, way that he says things. But the movie just drips with atmosphere, it just breezes right along through its plot. A lot of interesting things, like the autopsy scene is really atmospheric. You know, you see everybody put the smelling stuff on their nose and they just go through, and it's not graphic.
The sound of the camera going on.
Yeah, and it's not graphic, and it's not intended to be. It's just intended to feel very real.
The only time we see it is in close-up, but we're so close, we're still not really seeing anything.
No, and what is it, the fingers that we see, and then when they pull the cocoon out of her throat. But yeah, it's just such an atmospheric scene, and there's nothing in it to like. If I remember right, there's no score. The only noise going on is the dialogue and the camera.
Yeah.
Um, kind of like Texas Chainsaw.
I was gonna say it brings back the opening sounds of that.
Yeah. But it's a very well done movie. Deserves the attention it gets. It's definitely one of the finest suspense films ever made.
Yeah, you talk about the suspense. Obviously, one of the most iconic scenes. I mean, I'm throwing the word iconic around a lot, which I don't normally try to do. But I mean, we are talking about our favorite movies of all time, so it's gonna come up. The Prison Break. I mean, the scene we were just talking about, there where we saw the filming location, is like one of the ultimate scenes in suspense movie history, thrillers, whatever.
Yeah, because he's out, and the first thing that you do is you think, well, Clarice is done. He doesn't care. That's the furthest thing from his mind.
It's funny, he also breaks out wearing somebody's human face. We just talked about Texas Chainsaw. It's kind of an interesting connection.
Yeah, it is. It is.
It's almost like you can see influence throughout the movie a little bit.
And you get to see how much Lecter just enjoys fucking with people. Like the was she a senator from Tennessee?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The famous shot of him wearing the mask and being wheeled around.
Yeah. Wheeled around. You make it sound like he's just wheel around. But no, so many iconic scenes in these movies. So many great performances. There's a reason that it won the awards that it did. It was, if I remember correctly, it's the last movie to successfully sweep.
Yeah, the big 5 categories.
Yeah.
Picture, director, actor, actress, and one of the screenplays.
Yeah, and there's a reason. It's another movie everybody's seen. Another one with iconic lines. You don't know what pain is. It puts the lotion in the basket. Ted Levine, ironically, gets a lot of them.
Then,
would you fuck me? I'd fuck me. All those lines.
A sense of stereo wants to test me is almost not even worth bringing up because everybody knows already.
Yeah, and it's been parodied so many times. But yeah, just excellent film. And actually, really, if you take Hannibal out and Hannibal Rising, a very good collection of films. Red Dragon's good, Manhunter's good. So it's a good movie and a good series. Definitely, if you consider it a sequel, it's definitely a sequel that surpassed the original. So, number 10, we're going to go from suspense movies to comic book movie. Another one everybody and their brother has seen. Another one that we've talked about extensively on here. I think this will be your third go-around on it in a video.
Probably.
Probably so.
If not more.
Yeah. Number 10 is The Dark Knight. And, there's not really much more we could say about The Dark Knight we haven't already said. It's a fantastic movie. It has the performances, I forever will say that Aaron Eckhart is this movie's Ted Levine from the last one. There's all kinds of good performances going on around him, and he's just kind of forgotten, which is sad, because he does really well. Heath Ledger's Joker is what it is. A lot of people consider that the greatest comic book performance of all time. I can definitely see why. He is really good. I'm going to go out on a limb, and this is going to interest a lot of people, or make them hate me, I don't know. But I think Heath Ledger may only be supplanted in comic book movie performances by Downey in Endgame, or in the Avengers series as a whole. But it's kind of not fair because he have more to work with. But the movie's great. We all know the plot. The plot's kind of all over the place, which is what you expect from a Joker character. He just goes from scheme to scheme to scheme to scheme to scheme. This doesn't work, okay, let's do another scheme. This doesn't work, let's do another scheme.
Anything he says, the opposite's probably the truth.
Yeah, like when he intentionally reverses the addresses, which I've seen theories that people say that he really thought he was giving the right ones and just got confused.
When he says he's an agent of chaos, when he's clearly thought all this shit out very extensively.
Yeah, and the way that he wins Harvey Dent over to his side. One thing I will say is, and this was kind of disappointing, the last time I gave this movie a rewatch, it originally was up a little higher. It was about spot 6 or 7. But it fell to number 10. The last time I watched this movie, it did kind of feel like it dragged a little bit. I don't know why it did. Maybe it was just a weird viewing of it. Um, but I mean, it just seemed to happen. But I mean, outside of that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the movie.
It could also be, it's just, I mean, when you say a movie is one of your favorites, typically you can go back to it over and over again and never get sick of it. But there are some circumstances where if you watch something enough, you might eventually get to that point.
Yeah, that can happen with anything. That's why, you don't watch your favorite movie every single day.
I probably could, but I don't.
No, because you could run that risk.
Yeah.
But as far as The Dark Knight itself, I mean, it's a good movie. Everybody's seen it. Most people that have seen it love it. It's still considered one of the best comic book movies of all time. To me, it's kind of ironic that probably one of the worst performances in it, at least as one side of his character, is Bale as Batman, because Bale has become such a larger-than-life actor at this point. The dude just, bleeds Oscar nominations. His Bruce Wayne's fantastic. His Bruce Wayne was always fantastic. And I think it just comes down to the Batman voice, which we've talked about before.
Everybody's talked about.
Yeah, yeah. I love that Cillian Murphy comes back, and then comes back yet again in the sequel. I love that he's the recurring character in this little series. This is a movie that allows Gary Oldman to really shine through. It gives him a lot to work with his struggle of trying to accept Harvey and then try to atone for what happened to Harvey, even though it wasn't really his fault. So Gary Oldman has a lot to work with. Just good performances, good action. There's the car chase scene may be one of the best car chase scenes in movie history.
The armored car chase, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a scene I can just watch over and over again.
It's beautiful. When you realize that it's practical effects, it just makes it that much more impressive.
I still remember how big of a deal it was when it was revealed that, because there were so many advertisements with the Batpod before it came out. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew the Batpod was a part of the Ton War.
Yeah, that was a neat little side thing there, for sure. But yeah, we've talked about this movie extensively. Check out the Batman video. Ooh, excuse me. The Batman video on that one to learn a little bit more about what we said. But yeah, there's a reason that it's here. It'll always probably stick around up here. It's just it's a very, very good movie, especially it's a very deep comic book movie, and it was the first to kind of start that trend of superhero movies can make you think and put you in situations where you have to think. It treated you like an adult, which is what a lot of us craved. For the longest time, comic book movies were considered kid stuff. Thank you, Batman and Robin. But this kind of brought us back out, and I think without this movie, the MCU isn't the success that it is. Because this movie told us that we could take those movies seriously again. And, Iron Man came out the same year and just took off from there. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on The Dark Knight.
Alright, my number 10, totally different direction. And pretty much everything we've talked about.
Just,
I don't...
I'm kidding.
Yeah, you haven't seen it, so you can't say anything.
That is true, I can't.
I've talked about this just a little bit in reference, because I've talked about things similar to it. But my number 10 is the incomparable adaptation of Beauty and the Beast by Jean Cocteau. And the thing about this French adaptation of Beauty and the Beast, with it being one of the first cinematic ones, because obviously we've gotten, the Disney version, and then there's been a couple of other French ones, I think Vincent Cassel did one.
Hell, the Disney version ran for Best Picture.
Yeah. But this one is kind of it's the same story, and it's the same story points, you'll recognize, but the way it's told is a way so unique that it obviously transcends, adapting this story in itself, but just movies in general. Just the way it tells a story at all, in any capacity, is really unmatched. Because when you look at who Cocteau was exactly, he was like a surrealist, he was like a poet, he was like a painter, and it's like, oh, by the way, I kind of make movies too. This was almost like a side thing. And you can see somebody that's like a poet and a painter when you look at this movie. where it's almost all entirely visual. Like there is some moments that drive it dialogue-wise, like him saying, every night I'm gonna ask you to be my wife and stuff like that. I can't do the voice. I'm not even gonna try. You could probably take the dialogue out of this entirely and tell it entirely visually, and the point would be made. Maybe even more so to a degree. Because, I mean, at the same time, as I was talking about, though, it does kind of... Another one of the iconic things about it is Murray's voice. So it's got to be in there somewhere. But even so, I think you get the idea. And once again, sort of like I was talking about with the Devil and Daniel Webster, when it's not in those moments, when it's not like them at the castle or their interactions with the Beast, it might seem maybe not quite as up to par as the rest of it. But there's still some stuff in there. He's constantly about having some sort of visual flair. Like one particular moment where Belle's cleaning a table and just the way she reflects off of it. Like there's always some sort of visual mastery going on here. But when it really kicks into gear is when her father goes to the castle. And the way this castle is brought to life, and the way we see it in sort of two different ways, like two different perspectives between when her father's there and when Belle's there. Because when her father's there, everything feels so incredibly creepy and sinister. Because obviously everything is going to be a practical effect in 1946, I think it is. So all the candles on the walls are being held by actual human arms, sticking out of the wall that are white. They look like they're fake, but then they move. And then you see the statues and the busts around, and the faces start moving, and it's like a haunted house. It's really haunting imagery that will creep you out to your core. And then finally the Beast is revealed, and the whole thing feels like a horror movie. But then it's a totally different feel when Belle goes there. When Belle is there, suddenly everything feels magical, and there's a sense of wonder to all this stuff. Even in the way the Beast is revealed, where he's got the light underneath his face, is startling at first, but then just the way everything is portrayed from then on, it's when it turns into the romance aspect of it, and we kind of see that transition from creepy and sinister and haunting to sort of romantic and magical and all that, and dreamlike, really. And it's, like I was talking about the Devil and Daniel Webster, kind of hard to explain. It's one of those movies that would not work in anything but black and white by the way the lighting works and the way everything is just has that feel to it. How everything feels sort of ghostly in a sense. Even the way when Belle starts moving through the house, she's kind of part of it, where the things move to appease her, where if she walks through curtains, there's arms there that are out of knight's armor that just pull the curtains for her. And that's all they are, they're just arms. And doors will just open, and when she walks towards them and out them, she's able to transport straight from the castle to her house that's through a magic glove or something. And there's a lot of use of fog and steam. There's a point in time where they show us whenever the Beast has killed something, his claws just have steam coming off of them. And it's just this imagery that just really etches itself in your mind as it goes on. And like I said, just kind of has that real surreal feeling, to where it feels something artistic more than anything else. This movie could have no story if it wanted to and keep this imagery, and it would be just as effective, and it would be just as haunting. And it's one of those things where it kind of just solidifies that immediately. The way Belle moves around also, it's almost like she floats around. The way, just everything, as soon as they're inside the castle, just takes on this whole other feel, you're in this entirely other world. And I don't know that I've seen anything even close to it replicated in another movie. The feel of it or anything, the visuals, any of that. And there's also the interesting idea of the casting of Murray in 3 different parts. Because he is the, if you're going to compare it to the Disney version, the Gaston type. And of course he's also playing the Beast and the Prince that the Beast had turned into. But the fact that we sort of see all 3 of those are a different performance and the Beast is the one that is the most sympathetic and the one that we're most attached to. And a lot of that is through his like relationship with Belle and the way we sort of see that transition, because there is like he seems, you know, super big and scary, and sometimes he's just unceremoniously just comes around a corner or something, and it's still like jarring and terrifying to a degree. But then as it goes on, it's like almost everything becomes like some sort of sensual allegory. Like it does become very sensual in a way that like they could only get away with in 1946, but the point is more than made. And the way it sort of toys with that also. And then eventually just getting to its final message, which is like, and I think that's also the idea of casting Murray in all three parts, is it's like, Cocteau is basically trying to get the point across that anybody can be a beast, like beasts are made rather than born. So when you see like the prince, or when you see the dude that's like the real villain pretty much, and it's the beast himself that we sympathize with the most. There's a whole sort of thing like that in there. So yeah, but like I said, it's hardly a movie you can really describe. It's something you really have to see. You really have to see it to believe it, honestly, with some of the imagery. But it definitely will never leave you once you've seen it for the first time. So that's how I feel about that. Are we going to my number 9? My number 9 is also something I talked about a while back, and that is 7. This DVD I have, which I do have this on Blu-ray now, but I will never get rid of this DVD because I love the whole idea of it looking like John Doe's notebook, the way you open it up. But yeah, so the thing about 7 is it's another one of those cases of I don't know what else I could say that I didn't say before, or other people haven't said before. But the thing that stands out about it most, of course, besides being what I think is still Fincher's best work, which is another one of those things where you ask anybody, they might say a different Fincher movie every time. The Social Network, it's got to be really close, but this one, I think, still barely comes out on top for me. It's the way...
Fight Club?
Yeah. I think it's the way it goes into the material. Because a lot of people find this... Like, a lot of people who aren't fans of this movie, the few of them that exist... find it way too excessive and like way too disturbing, getting inside John Doe's mind as much as we do. But I think this movie is a prime example of the way you can use that kind of stuff, and it actually does a service to storytelling, as opposed to being gratuitous and gory for the sake of it and all that. Especially since a lot of it is like, it's hard to even call it a violent movie because most of the time all we're seeing is aftermath, which is more than enough. But the thing about it is the way we get the details and the murders and like the gore and the killing. Yeah, in a worse movie that can seem really lazy to just rely on that for your thrills or whatever, to have the effect of the movie. But the meticulousness of the way they handle it, and the fact that that's even part of the character. Like, there's the whole scene where Somerset says that everything John Doe does is methodical, exacting, and he's patient about it, which is what makes him so threatening. And it's like the fact that Andrew Kevin Walker, when he wrote this, had to go into every single little detail about what John Doe did to these people. There's almost something like admirable in like the originality of it, which is, I think, that disturbing area a lot of people don't like to go in, which are the people that get kind of put off by it. But yeah, it's actually like genius, as fucked up as it is to say. The whole thing and the whole story. I was talking about before, I think some people found the story a bit gimmicky, and how it does almost sound like something you hear in a straight-to-DVD movie, like, oh, it's a serial killer and he's using the 7 deadly sins. But it's in a way that's more brilliant than you can ever imagine based on that, especially with the outcome. And the way that he has set it up to where, yeah, it's not just as easy as it's going to be 7 victims. There's a whole thing, there's a whole plan here, and the whole movie is building to that. And whether it be through their research, like I was telling you before, It's amazing how just Morgan Freeman going to the library and doing research can be so cinematic, and this movie pulls that off. And the way it shows the relationship between Mills, Somerset, and Tracy. And we see like their married life, and you think, oh, this is the point in the movie when we see their human side, and we see that, oh, they're not, always just cops on the job or whatever, and that's what it is. And oh, Tracy's the wife, and oh, she's probably pregnant, and you think that's just like, oh, we're just showing the human side of characters. The first time you don't really realize just how much they're setting up the climax in the most disturbing, horrific, yet memorable way possible, in one of the most famous movie endings ever. One of the most disturbing, any of that. Quoted, I guess you could say.
Satirized.
All of
parodied.
that. But despite all of that we just said, still powerful as fuck, that ending. Like, that ending never gets old. It never loses its power, no matter how many times it's been smoothed. One of my favorites, probably my favorite, is look up Morgan Freeman's unboxing video, and it's a parody of the end of the movie, and it's kind of brilliant, and all these things in between, like the sloth victim being one of the most memorable one of the most well executed jump scares ever. Mm-hmm. The whole Leland Orser scene. I think this was Leland Orser's first movie, and that was the performance he gave, which is incredible. Yeah, and then of course Spacey, we all are where we are now with Spacey, but I mean, this is still one of the best serial killer performances ever, in the short amount of time that he has. And some people may think, well, maybe it wasn't too much of a stretch for him to be a fucking weirdo, but even so, that's... So that's pretty much how I feel about Seven. Do you have anything to add about it?
It's another movie that just sucks you into its atmosphere.
Yeah.
It's dark, it's gloomy.
It's always raining.
Yeah. It's a movie that I don't recommend watching it when you're tired, because it will put you in the mood to go to sleep. And not because it's a boring movie, but just because the atmosphere is the kind of atmosphere that you're like, oh, this is a good day to take a nap. I'm not going to accomplish anything today.
But if you do fall asleep watching Seven, God help the imagery you'll probably see in your sleep.
Or what you'll wake up to. Yeah, very, very interesting movie. Definitely iconic ending. Iconic performances all the way around, and it just has its own distinct look. Like, it definitely can separate itself from other movies with just the look.
And what a way to... You can tell what the movie's up to. Like, what an opening it is to start with the gluttony victim. Mm-hmm. Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I feel about Seven.
Okay. So, for mine, we're going to move on to something a little more lighthearted. My number... What are we up to? 9?
Yes.
My number 9 is Big Fish. Big Fish, for you, what movie did you say it was? Shadow of a Doubt was a love at first sight movie for you. Mm-hmm. Big Fish was for me. I love the storytelling, I love the performances.
You saw it in the theater, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Ewan McGregor is just absolutely charming as the younger version of Albert Finney, the young Edward Bloom. He's a nice dude. He's definitely, out for bigger things with his adventures. Danny DeVito's the circus owner. Danny DeVito's really well with what he does, and his lawyer Deep Roy is interesting. It's one of those movies where, Ewan McGregor and Alison Lohman could really steal the show, because they're in the movie just as much, if not more, than the other two. Well, probably not Alison Lohman, but Ewan McGregor for sure. This definitely feels like it could be a movie that's a Ewan McGregor vehicle. That, it's designed to showcase him. And while Ewan McGregor brings it, Albert Finney and Jessica Lange are just amazing. Their chemistry, I mean, there's those memes out there, find a way that, or find somebody that looks at you the way that somebody looks at da-da-da. I'm sure you know the meme I'm talking about. In all seriousness, all memes aside, find somebody that looks at you the way Jessica Lange looks at Albert Finney in this movie. I mean, she just looks at him with every scene that she sees him is she just looks at him with such admiration, like he's the greatest thing in the world. And it's such a contrast because Billy Crudup as his son thinks that he's this liar and this manipulator and this, you know, kind of puppet master of everything. And it's just very two interesting interpretations where Billy Crudup looks at him and he just sees that he's full of shit, and Jessica Lange looks at him and he's the best thing in the world. There's no one better than him. It's very fascinating. I honestly, you and I talked about this. I think Jessica Lange is the standout performance in this movie. What she has to work with and the heartbreak of, you know, losing, you know, somebody that she's had her whole life, and with the stories that they have, you know, especially the bathtub scene when he's just laying in there. I don't remember I don't know how long it's been since you've seen this.
It's been a few years.
Yeah, but like the bathtub scene between her and Albert Finney is just great. It's just them being two people and her starting to break down, and he's just there to say, no, we're not doing that. You know, we're going to keep trucking. And of course the ending, you know, when Billy Crudup finally, you know, tells the story of what happens to him, I don't know what it is, but the ending of this movie destroys me. I don't know why. I don't particularly know why. I just know that when he's telling him the story, especially when he gets to the river at the end and everybody's there, it really grips me. That's why this movie is so high, because I've seen this movie probably 6 or 7 times and had a reaction to the ending all 6 or 7 times. It's just a very nice looking movie. You know, it's Tim Burton, so you know it's going to look impressive. You know the sets are going to be great. But unlike every other Tim Burton movie that's dark and gloomy, this one is so bright and colorful. Compared to any other, you know, Tim Burton film, I mean, you look at a movie like Beetlejuice, everything is kind of gothic and dark and kind of gritty, and that's how most of it is. The 89 Batman's that way. Edward Scissorhands is that way.
Sleepy Hollow.
Sleepy Hollow is that way. And Big Fish is just like, it's night and day. But it still works. The imagery still works. You know, you have some beautiful shots, like all the different shots of Spectre when it's like in its heyday. It's just really nice looking stuff. But yeah, Big Fish is a movie that I'll always go back to. I think it's great. I think the relationships are great. I think it's one of my favorite movies about people's relationships kind of intersecting and seeing how one character crosses into all these other lives and affects them. And affects them in the way that he does. Which kind of all comes together at the river scene at the end. And then just the reveal at the end. Like, it's... I don't really know how else to explain it except that it's one of those, you know, he still doesn't know. He still doesn't know what's true and what's not, because he sees enough at the funeral that some of it's definitely true. He even encounters that when he finds the letter where they thought that he had died, and he was like, oh, I just thought that was made up. And Jessica Lange tells him, she's like, not everything that he tells you is a fabrication. You know, some of this stuff really happened. So it's definitely very interesting. I remember you telling me, you said this movie doesn't really hit you the way that it hits other people.
Yeah, I didn't want to rain on the parade here, because what you're saying, as far as like how you're affected, that's like always what I hear when I hear about this movie, is people saying how much it moved them, like literally to tears. Like people weep watching this movie, and it's never done that for. I think I really like it, and I think it's perfectly executed and just this, you know, whole beautiful creation. But for some reason, emotionally, I just never quite got there. But like I said, I don't want to rain on the parade with that.
No, it's okay. It's good to kind of combat that and kind of see, you know, what's going on there. So you like Big Fish as well, then?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. The top comment on the back of the box here is a modern day Wizard of Oz. I don't know if I take it that far. I don't think that's related. I guess it kind of is, but at the same time, probably not. But yeah, I just think it's a really nice film. Hits all the emotional notes for me. The performances really help with that. You can tell everybody that's in this movie cares about being in this movie. They really bring it. Everybody from Ewan McGregor and Albert Finney, all the way down to Steve Buscemi, Matthew McGorry, all those guys. It's just a fun little movie that'll make you feel things. Marion Cotillard's in it. I think it's one of her first movies. I think.
That sounds right.
In 2003.
Yeah, might have been one of her first English-speaking roles.
That might be it, because she was big in France for a while. So we're going to switch gears. For number 8, we're going to go something that's not as emotional, but it is a shitload of fun, and I love this movie. It's one of those that I pop it back in from time to time, and when I pop it in, I try to remember why I love it so much, and then by the time the movie's over, I know exactly why I love it so much. Number 8 for me is Sideways. Thomas Hayden Church in this movie's hilarious. Paul Giamatti is, I want to say, it's kind of the perfect role for him. He kind of looks like the guy that life just shits on. And that's no offense to him. Paul Giamatti's brilliant. But, I don't know how many people have seen this. This might be one of the less popular movies that I have on my list. But
it was huge at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure where its reputation. I assume it's still the same. It's just some movie people don't talk about as much.
Yeah. But it's fun. These two guys go on their road trip for Thomas Hayden Church's wedding. And Paul Giamatti's just out there, and he's using it as a way to try to get away from his shitty life. And Jack is using it as kind of a last hurrah before he goes into his life. And it's kind of funny. I was telling you about this before one of the times we decided to do this list, when we knew Sideways was going to be on the list. I like the contrast that Miles, life shits all over Miles. He doesn't get his book published. He had his divorce. He's kind of, when he gets too much wine, he starts making dumb decisions.
He's looked down on too.
Yeah.
I just remember the opening party scene when the guy, he's trying to explain what he does for a living, and the guy's just like, I only read nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. And then you go to the other side, and you've got Jack, played by Thomas Hayden Church. And he's the opposite. He's shitting all over his life. He talks about how much he's dreading getting married, and how he's not going to have any freedom anymore, and
his only claim to success is the spray and wash commercial.
yeah, and his doctor role in the soap opera that ends up getting him laid later in the movie. But it's just an interesting contrast, and Miles has all these own fires in his life that he went on this trip to avoid, and he spends this whole trip putting out Jack's fires. Even starts one of his own with Virginia Madsen's character by letting something slip, and then all of a sudden he's created this whole new fire that Jack created. It's Jack's mess, and it's affecting him. And it's led to one of the things that we quote the most from the movie, when she calls him a fuckface. And he's just like, me? Like, what did I do? I didn't do this.
I still just love throughout the movie how boisterous Jack is, and how much of a contrast that is to Miles in general.
Yeah, they're two completely different guys.
I told you one of my favorite moments is a scene right out of like an over-the-top comedy. Despite this movie being so downplayed for the most part, it's when they're leaving the golf course, and he's just talking out loud like Jack does.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to convince him to get with Virginia Madsen. He's like, "Are you telling me you don't want that cozy little box to grip down on your Johnson?" Which is a great line in itself. And then they just happen to be passing by that dad with his kid. He was like, "Hey, there's children here."
And there's not really any other scenes like that. Like, the movie is very subtle. It's very quiet and maintained, and within its own little scope.
But it
does have some outlandish moments.
I was gonna say, it does eventually. It's building to a couple of moments.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a whole Miles breakdown,
Mm-hmm.
and then we've got the MC Gainey scene.
Yeah, we're building. We're not going balls to the wall right at the beginning. Like,
careful with your wording there.
Yeah, and it's like, And it's funny because you don't know how to feel about Miles because, like, you kind of feel bad that he gets looked down on. And then he goes and he stays with his mom, and his mom's like, oh, we'll go do this. And he's like, actually, I've got this going on. And then he turns around and takes money from her. Like, he takes money out of her drawer for him to be able to go on his little trip. And it's just...
And then he drinks and dials, and we realize that he's pretty pathetic.
Yeah.
And then...
Yeah, and he's...
I mean, we learn he's pathetic pretty quickly, but it gets worse.
Yeah, it's like, you think in this movie, you're like, oh, this is the guy I'm going to pull for. And then as time goes on, you're like, this dude just kind of sucks. Like,
But then we finally get a reason to root for him when Virginia Madsen comes into it.
Yeah, it gives...
He's got a direction to go.
Yeah, it gives him something
once.
to shoot for. The performances in it are fantastic from all four of the big parts. They all do really well. I'm normally not huge on ambiguous endings. This definitely has one.
It's the book-ending knots.
Yeah.
In the first scene and the last scene.
Mm-hmm. But it works really well in that regard. Yeah, I just think the movie's very, very funny.
The one thing I regret about this DVD that's mine is the disc is this like just illustration of Miles. Your disc is much better, where the design is just a ring that makes it look like somebody set a wine glass on it. I really wish mine looked like that.
I don't know, the drawing of Miles is pretty funny though. But yeah, especially the sideways bottle with the two of them standing in it and Miles looks so angry.
I think that's the cover of the book.
It might be. I don't know. But yeah, just this movie's just really wonderful. It's another movie that I liked pretty early on.
When we saw it in theaters, was
Yeah.
it kind of a at first sight thing?
Yeah, and every time I go back to it, I remember why I enjoyed it.
We did.
I always laugh. I always get a kick out of it.
We did it as a double feature with $1 Million Baby, and this seems so upbeat by comparison.
It is. It is. This is. It really is. So yeah, Sideways is a lot of fun. It's a great movie. It's a great road trip movie, and it's it's two guys that on the surface have absolutely nothing in common, and by the end of the movie they still really don't have anything in common.
We were also talking about the beauty of Tom Sanford's performance with the one serious moment that he gets.
Oh, when he thinks he's lost the wedding rings.
Yeah, because it's
and
like,
his wallet.
and it's like up to that point, he's just been that guy, like you were saying. He just shits on his life.
He's been irredeemable.
But then he finally sees like the error of his ways, and he's like, we finally see that he's conscious that there are consequences. But then in the next scene, he's right back to the way he was. They go back to MC Gainey's house, and he's like, dude, Miles, you do it.
Yeah, I guess I'll do everything. And then he wrecks Miles' car to justify his injury. And
He's so fucked up sometimes.
yeah, he is. He's a terrible friend. He's an absolutely awful friend. But at the same time, his words do have merit, where he tells Miles, stop wallowing.
We're going to
Move
get
forward.
your bones smooched.
Yeah. But at the same time, he tries to say, we'll get your book published, don't give up. We'll publish it together, and you kind of wonder if he says that and he's going to be like, well, Miles, it's your book, you do this. I'm just here to help.
It's kind of like, and I don't mean this in a bad way either, but it does kind of remind me sometimes, like me and Owen, where there will be sometimes where like we seem different enough to where people will look at us and go like, so how did this happen? This friendship, like how does this and how has it gone on?
And we actually do get that explanation. I forget who asked him, but Miles' response is just, I'm just Jack's college freshman roommate. And that's it. And that's all we get. We don't know how it lasted this long. We don't know what their relationship was like in college. But this is where we got to. But yeah, it's a wonderful little film. Always enjoyed it, and probably always will enjoy it. So, yeah. Sideways, if you haven't seen it, check it out.
Alright, my number 8 will pretty much take no time, because I talked about it extensively, really extensively, just back in December, And when I started that video, I said, I don't know if there's anything I can say about this that nobody has said already. So, yeah, everything's been said, but I might as well at least acknowledge that it's one of my favorite movies of all time. Apparently number 8 specifically. That's The Lion King. I think we both have one animated movie. This would be mine. And, yeah, there's just really even nothing to say. All of the songs are perfect. There's not a song wasted, because we're not talking about Morning Report. The voice cast is perfect. One of the things I talked about before was the fact that you see how recognizable the voice cast is, but you look at other animated movies, and it's like, it's kind of always in your mind who the actor is playing the character. But it could be because we grew up with this movie before we really knew them, but it also could be just how great the voice work is. I never think to associate these characters with their actor, or the other way around. No matter how much we grew up with Ferris Bueller, or Darth Vader, Simba, Mufasa were always Matthew Broderick's voice or James Earl Jones' voice, and they were never anything but that. And that goes through all the cast.
It's also an inside job.
The animation is perfect, particularly the really elaborate stuff like the Stampede, which pretty much set the stage for the lengths that animation could go.
It's really surprising that as good as the animation in this is, it was actually Disney's like B team of animators.
Yeah, because they were all busy with Pocahontas, because
Yeah.
they thought that was going to be their big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time Pocahontas came out, this movie was still the big deal a year later.
And Pocahontas came out and everybody was just like, oh, okay.
The story, I went into detail about how Scar is a Disney villain that will not be matched. No matter how much you go into Frollo or any of the likes, Scar is like the ultimate Disney villain to me. He's got his own, hyena Nazis. His whole plot, which I'm still haven't quite deciphered, with the whole Stampede. And it's like he was kind of half knowing what he was doing, half kind of coming up with it in the moment, and the stuff he came up with in the moment got fucking crazier. And he's just this really perfect villain. And it's like, yeah, they're doing Hamlet. God, they're doing a Hamlet in a really kind of original and creative way. I know you're wondering about original because Kimba the White Lion, the plagiarism thing and all that. But you can say plagiarism, you can say stuff like that, you can say Hamlet or whatever. But there is something to this movie that has stood the test of time for a reason. You can't watch Kimba the White Lion and see the whole Circle of Life number at the beginning. You can't see stuff like the Stampede the way we see it here. The ending where the Circle of Life comes back around and we see Simba send Pride Rock in the rain, and the spirit of Mufasa says, remember one last time, and that feeling that gives you that will never go away no matter how old you get, even if you saw this when you were 4 years old like I was when it came out. None of that goes away, and it probably never will. And like I said, some movies may grow off of you, some movies grow over time, and this is one that will just always be there, will always have the power that it does. Even when you have the farting sidekicks like Timon and Pumbaa, they're there for a reason. They saved Simba's life and saved him from becoming the super villain that Scar surely would have made him. Scar would have ruined his life to an impossible degree. He could have never come back from. He probably could have become a Scar himself if it weren't for the fact that Timon and Pumbaa and their bugs and their grubs and shit came in. They sang Hakuna Matata and shit and brought the king back and saved Pride Rock. Like, say what you will about Timon and Pumbaa, they fucking did that. So, yeah. And like I said, it's kind of the movie that made me discover romanticism. I was saying in the video, the scene between him and Nala with Can You Feel the Love Tonight, it's kind of the first time I remember feeling like I had felt like what romance was. So that's... I don't know what I can credit this movie for so many things. And it is the movie that will always be as powerful as it was. Also, if you can see it on a theater screen, that is extremely highly recommended as well. Do you have anything to add?
No, not really. I mean, it's the movie. It's one of those movies that kind of speaks for itself. Its reputation, what people know about it, how many people have seen it.
And I've got animated movies that I love so much. Snow White, Bambi, Great Mouse Detective, all that. But whenever I'm asked what my favorite animated movie is, I don't even have to hesitate, and I never have had to. So, yeah. Is that it for Lion King? Mm-hmm. All right. So I'm going on to number 7. My number 7 is totally different. Yet another case of maybe not the first thing you would think of, but apparently this one was a little interesting because we're going to talk about the Coen brothers. And for the longest time, I felt like my favorite Coen brothers movie was probably Fargo, with No Country for Old Men kind of right there. But there's also a Coen brothers movie that has always kind of stayed with me, and I also always consider it a favorite. And it's a movie I've actually maybe revisited more times than Fargo and No Country for Old Men. And I've seen Fargo and No Country for Old Men countless times. But this is a movie I always, always come back to. I used to do Coen Brothers marathons when I first discovered their movies, and would go out and rent them like in bulk. And this was always the one I watched first, every time. Which I think is the reason I've seen it so many times. And that's Barton Fink. And I don't know if it's the writer aspect might have a lot to do with this. But first things first about this particular DVD. If you haven't seen the movie, we might go into stuff that you shouldn't hear. But also, the DVD menu for this movie is the biggest spoiler in the history of spoilers. I have no idea who the hell's call that was to make this DVD menu the menu that it is, but that's what it is. So that warning is out there. So one of the many great things about Barton Fink, of course, is the writing itself. I have a book that is a collection of 4 Coen Brothers scripts. It's their first 4. It's Blood Simple, Raising Arizona, Miller's Crossing, and this. And I have read the script to this movie almost as many times as I've actually watched the movie, because the writing is just so... It's exactly the movie, just on paper, and I get just as much a joy out of it reading it as I do watching it. Almost. There's some stuff in the movie that you never quite get through words, like the amazing production design and a lot of the performances. But really, I think one of the things that stood out to me and why I had a connection to it was the way it portrays writing. Like, Barton Fink, as manic and as, like, maybe cold as he might seem, to me is, like, one of the most relatable characters in movie history. The way hearing Barton talk about writing put into words things when I was first writing that I couldn't quite put into words. Like, one scene in particular that stood out to me was towards the end when he's talking to Lipnick, Michael Lerner's character, the big producer, and he's trying to get him to do a play-by-play of the script he's doing, the Wallace-Berry wrestling movie. And Barton has to stop him and say, like, I can't force my writing into words before I've written it, because then, like, it'll eventually change, and then I'll never get it back what it was. And it's like, I've done that shit. And, like, many times. And as soon as I heard Barton say that, I was like, oh, I'm not doing that fucking shit anymore. It's a thing that I now know. And then the way it takes jabs at Hollywood also, but, like, particularly through the Lerner character. Lerner, the only actor who managed to score a nomination for this, interestingly enough. Where it's like, it really feels like it's sort of skewering Hollywood and the producers and the way they approach, the way they treat writers and scripts and all that. But it doesn't feel bitter so much as it because the barbs are so clever. It doesn't feel like it's necessarily coming from a bitter place. Like, if there was a producer, I feel like if there are a lot of producers in Hollywood that could watch this movie and see Michael Lerner's character, and instead of being offended, they'll say, "Yep, that's totally me." And it's like, "Yep, I'm just going to completely admit to that." But yeah, apart from that, obviously because it's got an amazing supporting cast, Tony Shalhoub is one of the unsung heroes of this movie. Ben Geiser's one of my favorite characters in it. I always loved his line of when they're in the restaurant, he's like, you throw a rock in this joint and you'll hit a writer, and do me a favor, Fink, throw it hard. And there's John Mahoney, who's basically embodies the whole never meet your heroes thing. And of course, the main supporting character being John Goodman as his neighbor in the Hotel Earl, who basically teaches him the ways of wrestling so he can get his script going. And yeah, a lot of people thought that Goodman should have gotten the nomination over Lerner, and I do get that. I love what Lerner does, so I've never been like upset that he was nominated. But there is so much that Goodman's doing here because there's so much to his character that we don't know yet throughout the movie. But when you go back and watch it, you can kind of see. And he has these certain tics in him that you recognize that sort of make you uncomfortable, not in the way necessarily his character eventually gets to, but sort of socially. Like when you see the moments when, because Barton knows himself for like, just going on and on about himself. And you can see Charlie continuously getting cut off. And you see like, these little tics in Goodman where he's like, there's something else going on in his head. And it almost comes out whenever Barton interrupts him. But the movie keeps hiding it and his performance keeps hiding it. And then when it eventually comes out, and that's sort of the great thing about this movie, is that there's like a horror hiding in plain sight throughout it. Because there's obviously something, sort of darkly comedic about it, but then it's also kind of a period movie. But at its heart, it's pretty much a horror movie. Kind of the way I was talking about with The Devil and Daniel Webster. Where it's like, when he first hears Charlie and he's like laughing through the walls, and it sounds like a combination of like laughing and weeping and moaning. And we're not quite sure. The way the movie uses sound too. There's one time where he's watching the dailies for Devil on the Canvas, and it's the sound of those guys wrestling and like the way they growl. And it's like when he's spending the night with Judy Davis just before something unthinkable happens to her overnight. The camera goes into the sink and zooms down into the drain, and we hear the sounds of the wrestlers again. And it's just like sort of sounds monstrous and otherworldly. And it's like just this whole creepy thing. So it's like, it does seem like it comes out of nowhere when the big reveal happens. And it's like, what the hell is this movie now? But with all those clues that this movie is basically a horror movie from the word go, the twist maybe isn't so sudden. Especially when you look at those tics in Charlie. That seems like he's hiding something about his character. And it's like, they build it as a horror movie solely through the atmosphere. Like, until the shit starts happening, it's solely through the atmosphere that everything feels really off. Because there's the whole thing that, the whole metaphor that the Hotel Earl is basically hell. Like the fact that not only does it just eventually, burst into flame spontaneously, but there's also the thing of when we meet Chet, Steve Buscemi, the bellboy, who's also one of my favorite characters, the way he pushes over the car that just says Chet with an exclamation point. He's like, just call me if you need anything. The first time we see Chet, it's this amazing thing when he hits the bell on the desk, and the bell just like resonates until Chet comes all the way out of a trapdoor in the floor for some reason, comes over to the desk, gets everything situated, and then just touches the bell and stops it from ringing. And it's like the whole hell symbolism of Chet coming out of the ground for some reason. And then there's when he goes into the elevator and the operator's there, and he's like, what floor? And he says 6. And then he says, next stop 6. And then they get to the floor, and he's like, this stop is 6. It's like they just said 6 3 times. And then there's the whole thing of the clues about Charlie, like, whenever Barton's wallpaper peels, it's always either when Charlie's there or when Charlie's just left. And then every time, it's when Charlie's in the building, when the building is, like, unbearably hot. It's so foreboding. Like, I love Turturro's delivery of when the cops are there and they're like, God, it's so hot in here. And he's like, it's hot in here. Charlie's back. And then that's when the big ending happens. And he literally brings the fire with him. And it's this just crazy-ass thing. And then the way it gets more abstract about certain things, like the hell thing, sure, but then there's also the box thing, where you can look at it from the more literal perspective, like, it's probably Judy Davis's head. But it's also the whole thing about it being Barton's mind and that whole symbolic thing. And it's like when that's there, then he finally gets the script and play and all that. I've also had many moments like he does with Garland on the phone, where it's like, I really think this is the big one, like, this is the best thing I've ever done. And Garland's like, well, alright, but it's late. It's like, thanks, Garland, for all the encouragement. There might be something wrong with me. I don't think Barton Fink as a character should be as relatable as he is to me. But here we are. So like I said, it's the one that I kind of really come back to the most as far as the Coen Brothers movies go, and I revisit it over and over again, and I feel like there's always something in there, and so I just really love it. So that's always been one of my favorites as well.
So with my number 7, we're sticking to comedy. This is maybe the newest movie on the list? No. I don't remember when it came out.
This one's 2007.
Okay, then it's not the newest movie on the list. There's one that's newer that's later. But this is sticking with comedy. I think a lot of people have seen this one too.
Yeah.
It's pretty
I hear it
popular.
referenced a lot.
Yeah. But my number 7 movie is Hot Fuzz. Hot Fuzz is fucking hilarious. Every time I watch it, I laugh my ass off. There's a lot to unpack with it. Simon Pegg is hilarious as the straight guy in this one. Nick Frost is great as the kind of bubbling partner.
It's really interesting how convincing Simon Pegg is as an action hero.
Yeah, it is very strange.
I mean, he's got the Mission Impossible movies now, but I mean, as a lead, and the fact that he actually starts off as a guy, he's able to do both the action hero thing and the guy that knows that paperwork needs to be done and stuff like that.
Yeah, he's the pin pusher and the action hero. Yeah, he's just brilliant. The movie is super clever. There's a lot of things that just fly by. The movie goes 1,000 miles an hour with like the references and the jokes and all
the way those jokes come back.
Yeah.
Like everything in the Shaun of the Dead was the same way. It's basically their style, particularly in the Cornetto trilogy, where like everything in the first half is the setup to a payoff in the second half.
Yeah, and this movie delivers on all of them. Jim Broadbent's great. Jim Broadbent is he starts the movie spoilers. He starts the movie so reserved and so quiet and so like, welcome to Sanford. It's wonderful. And by the end, he's just a total fucking loon. Like, it's so great. He even at one point has the fucking MGM line roar as he's like making a getaway from somewhere. It's just fantastic. It's so funny to see an actor of Jim Broadbent's caliber play a role that funny. Like his big reveal, or not really reveal, but one of his big moments is just yelling the line, "He's not even from round here." Like he's so angry that Simon Pegg's just not from their town.
I don't know what's funnier between the chandelier falling as he roars like the MGM lion, or when he runs out of the room and they're still like growling on the soundtrack.
It's hilarious. The movie is just.
But
what else can you say about it? I mean, it's
because
fantastic.
We talk about it being as funny as it is, but it's also a totally kick-ass action movie.
It is. Especially the ending is really intense. There's all kinds of fun little action movie tropes in it too. You got. It's funny because your red herring in this movie doesn't end up being a red herring. Well, he ends up being a red herring, but not. Timothy Dalton is the most obvious bad guy in the world. And just when you think that he's the red herring and he's cleared, it turns out that he is still the bad guy. It's just let's just say he's not working alone. But yeah, the movie's it's great. The way it flows, the way the jokes come out. It's super funny. The action scenes are great. It's just an all-around enjoyable movie.
And there's so many different kinds of comedy, whether it be a setup payoff thing or just one single line, or there's a lot of physical comedy. I always love the visual gag of him throwing the can of spray paint all the way until it hits the dude in the head and just in the distance.
Yeah.
The callback to Shaun of the Dead when they're doing the fence hopping,
Mm-hmm.
and Nick Frost just crashes through it.
Yeah. Stephen Merchant in the movie when Simon Pegg's on the phone, he's like, "Oh, pea stick, piss sticker, okay." And then we just cut to Stephen Merchant, and he's like, "Yes, Mr. Sticker, what did the swan look like?" It's hilarious.
And that payoff is funny in itself, and then it keeps being funny because we now get to see Stephen Merchant describe what a swan looks like. In totally straight face.
Yeah. Stephen Merchant's brilliant at stuff like that. He's great. Yeah, Hot Fuzz is just a blast. No pun intended. With that being said, my number 6 movie, it's now time to talk about the animated movie on my list. This actually is the only one of my top 15 and honorable mention that I don't own, which is kind of strange, especially as high as it is, but it'll eventually get there.
Yeah, it's worth. I don't know if we've mentioned yet that you actually don't keep your cases. You keep them in the CD cases, like the books.
Mm-hmm.
So all the cases here are mine, which is how this has come to be.
Yeah. But my number 15, and a lot of people are going to be like, really? What? Because I don't think this appears a lot in people's favorites.
It's got a pretty. You might be underestimating the crowd behind this movie.
Well, leave it in the comments and let me know. Finding Nemo is my number 6 film. Where to start? First of all, I think the movie just looks really nice. I love the ocean aesthetic. I love the way it's animated. The dentist's office is very vibrant and colorful and has its own little unique feel to it.
And didn't they also do like really extensive research to make sure the portrayal of the ocean was like accurate?
Yeah, they really did their homework on this one. The voice acting in it's great. Albert Brooks is great. Ellen DeGeneres knocks it out of the park. What is it you've always told me about Ellen DeGeneres in this movie? As far as what you would award her?
Oh yeah, I would totally give Ellen an Oscar for this movie. Like I really would. Like, and I don't mean like as a voice performance as a side thing. I mean like supporting actress. And I'm dead serious. And there's also talking about Albert Brooks. There's a nice special feature where it's the joke that he can't tell throughout the movie. Like he can't get to the punchline. There's like an hour of footage of just him telling that joke in certain ways, and sometimes in dirtier ways that they would have never made it into the movie. And there's like a whole sort of like other roll of film of him just doing that.
That's funny. But you got Jeffrey Rush as the Pelican. Nigel, that was his name. You've got the... I'm sorry, it's like 2:30 a.m.
Yeah. We started this at like midnight.
Yeah. I was going to go somewhere else with this. All the voices in the tank, Willem Dafoe, Brad Garrett, everybody that's in the tank with him.
I think Bonnie Hunt's in there, Austin Pendleton.
It's a very stacked voice cast. Eric Bana, I think, is Jacques or someone else. Maybe one of the sharks.
He's one of the sharks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's one of the sharks that says he's really a nice guy.
There was another. The last time I watched it, there's another random person in the credits, and I cannot remember for the life of me who it is. But I saw them, and I was like, really? They have a bit part in this? But I cannot remember for the life of me who it is.
Oh no! Obviously, Ratzenberger.
Yeah, of course, of course. The other thing I think I love about Nemo is, if you don't count Darla, there's not really a villain. A lot of Disney movies, like you alluded to Scar earlier.
I guess we're also taking Bruce out of the equation.
Yeah, because Bruce is just a victim of unfortunate circumstance.
He's really a nice guy.
Yeah, he is. He is. That was 100% true. But the villain of the movie is essentially the journey.
Just the hazards.
Yeah, just the different hazards he encounters. The jellyfish, the The fish with the light bulb. Well, not really a light bulb, but like the fish with the
God,
light.
that thing's scary. That was the teaser trailer.
Yeah, that thing is frightening. I 100% agree with that. Oh, what else? The whale for a while, before we realized that Dory was right and she was speaking whale. And so you don't have like I would say the biggest villain is Darla, and really it's not to fight Darla; it's just to avoid Darla. But Darla's introduction's great. When she just slams the door open and there's like a little pause and then the picture falls and it's playing like the Psycho theme. Her introduction's probably one of my favorite character introductions in a Pixar movie. Just because, just the way it happens, just because they anticipate it. Like there's a kid that shows up before Darla gets there and he shows up and they're like, oh, okay. And then just out of nowhere, she's just there. And like they have to do like, oh shit.
So really, if Darla's the villain, that probably means the villain's really P. Sherman, because he's the one that took Nemo.
Yeah, but if Nemo had listened to his dad, it would have happened.
I love that we've spent so much of this looking for a villain and finding Nemo.
Yeah, I guess the real villain is the guy that took him on the trip in the first place, Mr. Ray. No, Mr. Ray's delightful. He's a delightful teacher. He even tries to talk everything down. Mr. Ray got a hiccup out of it. But in addition to all that, the movie hits some really nice emotional moments. There's a lot of powerful scenes in it. You know, when he's yelling at Dory and the whale, and he comes to terms when he says you can't do it, Nemo, that he's not treating her any better than he would have treated Nemo, which is how he got in this mess in the first place. You know, there's the scene where, you know, he has to trust Nemo when Nemo's telling all the other fish to swim down, to break the net, to get that out there, which kind of, I guess it does kind of feel like a little bit of an extra, like, we didn't need this to happen to drive home the point. But at the same time, I do find it to be important because it's our way of showing that Marlin has grown enough to trust him.
It's basically like 10 years later, it had an equivalent when Gravity should have been ending, and then Sandra Bullock starts drowning. Mm-hmm. It's like, did we really need one more conflict? Mm-hmm. Like, it's almost parody at this point.
Yeah. But the East Australian current turtles are fun. You know, Marlin has that moment where he thinks that she's like super injured, and she's just playing hide and seek. She just wakes up and goes. I think the ending's really good. I don't know why. This is another one where the ending kind of gets me. It's when he's like swimming away with Mr. Ray, and Marlin just tells him goodbye, and he's like perfectly okay with it. I just think it's a very strong ending. Overall it's just a very it's an easy to watch movie. It's a fun little story, and it's a nice looking movie. And you can tell like the attention to detail in the ocean is there. Finding Dory was good. I don't think it was as good as Nemo was.
I don't think anybody would say that it was, but even people like me that actually will defend it.
Yeah, I don't think it was awful by any stretch of the imagination. This one I think just had more heart, had more going for it, and overall was just a better experience. So this is number 6, right before the top 5.
Just before I get to the top 5, my number 6 is an interesting case, and it's also been kind of a long time coming talking about it here, because I kind of feel like a favorites list or a top list or whatever from an individual person is never really complete unless there's at least one movie that is just so out there it makes everybody say, why? Or that one of all things? I feel like we all, if you've seen enough movies, at least one of those is going to be on a list like this. And we're under the assumption this one's the one on mine, right?
Yeah.
I was initially,
I don't know what mine would be.
Before you just before you suggested doing this type of video, I was going to do a video on this movie by itself, just to explain why it's one of my favorite movies ever. Because I say this title, and people are like, what in the hell?
You guys are going to be really surprised.
Of all things.
You guys are going to be like, what?
But anybody that knows me already knows this, because this was my favorite movie for a very long time. Like, for a weird amount of time. Mind you, I was like a teen, like my early teen years, but still. And somehow it's carried along this long that I still have it at number 6, doing something like this. It's a movie you may have seen and just totally forgot about. I think that's the case with most people.
People saw it?
Very few. Like when it came on cable, probably.
Oh, okay.
Certainly not in theaters. It was out in theaters for like less than a week. After having been it was shot in 1999 and then shelled for 3 years before they released it for a week. Was its release. It's a movie called Knockaround Guys, which may look familiar. You may have seen it at your local Goodwill a few times, just laying around. And it's always been one of my favorite movies, and I will do my best to explain why. I've never really had to explain why until now, so I'll do my best. One of the first things you'll notice is the lead character is played by Barry Pepper. And if there's anything I think we can all agree on, wouldn't it be great if Barry Pepper had more leading roles? And this movie also convinces me of that just as much.
He was on the ground before we hit the shot!
Yeah, I'm going to bring that up in a second, actually. So, the interesting thing about this movie to me, and it may seem very basic, I think that's the reason a lot of critics dismissed it, was they just found it very basic, or they found it very bland or something.
I mean, the back of the box is advertising with an exclamation point that there's animated menus.
It was DVD was still an early thing. So we were in the very early 2000s. But the thing here is, I genuinely like the concept and the setup. Where Barry Pepper's character, Matty, is our protagonist, where he's basically in a place where crime is inevitable in his life. Because his father is a gangster played by Dennis Hopper, who's like right under the top gangsters, that we learn later. And the opening scene is him being brought in. It's this very, like, scene, like, right out of The Sopranos, where his uncle, John Malkovich, is bringing him down into a basement, where he's being forced to shoot a guy that he's basically grown up to, like, a guy that's basically a close friend of the family because he ratted out Dennis Hopper and got him arrested. And because he's a child, he's like 12 years old, he can't bring himself to do it, despite the fact that John Malkovich tells him he needs to. And this basically ruins any aspirations of leading the life of crime that his father does, that he has. There's like a whole deleted subplot, or like detail, where he adopts the nickname Matty Dimes, and the Dimes comes from the dime that John Malkovich gave him to call a cab because he couldn't do the hit. And then it basically just becomes this thing that follows him. So then and then we fast forward to where he's an adult, and he's trying to get a job as a sports agent. And we realize that he's being rejected again because his resume has the company that is clearly his dad's cover business. And everybody in the town recognizes this at this point and knows to associate him with Dennis Hopper. And so he's constantly getting rejected by job interviews. So he's rejected by the life of crime because of his father, and he's rejected by the outside world due to his father. And he's just stuck in the middle and cannot go anywhere. And the more he tries to bounce back, the more he realizes maybe the life of crime is inevitable. So he's constantly trying to get back into Hopper's good graces in hopes of being in the room with him and being in the life of crime with him. So he's got to prove himself in some way. And in the meantime, he's hanging out with the other guys that are pretty much in the same boat. They also have criminal fathers whose shadow they're living in, and they only have their names to go off of. Sometimes that's a burden, sometimes it helps them out, depending on it. So there's the whole thing where he and his best friend's Chris Scarpa, Scarpa's also a really big name that we want. He's an unseen character through the whole movie, but he's built up like he's a huge deal, and that's the shadow that Chris is living under. And they just talk about how they're just burned by their fathers and how they're stuck in this area. And it really sets up like this whole conflict for the central characters through this movie. And then we're introduced to Seth Green, who's like this fuck up cocaine addict with a plane, who's actually going to be very useful in that regard. And Vin Diesel. And the interesting thing about Vin Diesel being in this movie is that it has like the most memorable scenes of his career. Like the scene where he beats the holy shit out of Kevin Gage in the bar for like 5 minutes is a scene that's got like millions of hits on YouTube, but hardly anybody can tell you what movie it's from. It's one of those. And then the opening scene, his first scene, when he smashes the arcade games and does the milk guy's getting paid, the potato guy's getting paid, the beer guy's getting paid, every fucking body's getting paid. I think he's genuinely good in this movie. Like, you can say what you will about Vin Diesel as an actor, but I do think he's genuinely good in this movie, and because he's a character that he's kind of the opposite of what like Maddie and Chris are, where he's the one that, as Malkovich says later, like when Maddie was in the basement and was told to pull a trigger at 12 years old, he couldn't do it. And you put Vin Diesel's character in that same situation, whether he's a toddler or 100 years old, he will do it. Because that's just his way. But the way we see him throughout the movie, there's almost, it would be a cynicism about the whole thing. Like, he's very aware that he's stuck in this life forever. He's got nowhere else to go but down a violent path, and he's just accepted it at this point. But there's like a wisdom in it. But there's also a really lived-in relationship between him and Maddie, especially that scene on the shooting range where he's describing this. And that's talking about, you were quoting Barry Pepper and Saving Private Ryan, which the two of them had shot just before they shot this. Because this was shot in 99 and Private Ryan came out in 98. So there was already like an established brotherhood between Barry Pepper and Vin Diesel by this point, having been through that movie and the training and all that. And you can kind of still sense that, like it still lingers in these scenes where it's just the two of them. And there's this moment I always love between them. It's just really brief, where Maddie's like trying to figure out a gun, like he's trying to some gun type thing. And Taylor, Vin Diesel's character, just says like, just stick it back in there. He just kind of gives him this little, that's how you fix that thing. Just right in the middle of their conversation. There's just something so like big brotherly about that one moment. It's like so small. That just says everything about their relationship. So I really love that kind of stuff. Now, something I just kind of glossed over. This is a movie about gangsters, and the main gangsters are played by Dennis Hopper and John Malkovich. That's amazing. That is incredible casting. Especially Malkovich as the Uncle Role, who kind of has the one that's kind of really trying to help Maddie out by bringing him. He's the one that kind of convinces Hopper to get him into this situation. And like Malkovich is like so, like everybody has a Malkovich impression. You think about stuff like, Rounders or In the Line of Fire or something like that. Or just him in general.
Con Air.
Yeah. Every time in my life I've ever done an impression of John Malkovich, I'm saying a line from this movie. He has so many amazing lines in this. I could beat his ass carrying a lawn chair in my left hand. Just stuff like that. And then Dennis Hopper is the guy that's like, so he's like such a stone wall with Maddie trying to get into this life. And it's like we can sense between the two of them just that longing for acceptance, and how Hopper just will not let that pass. Like there's like no relationship with them whatsoever, despite the fact that they're father and son. Like you feel nothing between the two of them, and that's the point. So I think that really comes through in a big way, because Hopper doesn't have a lot of screen time at all, but I think that really comes through in a powerful way, especially at the end when we come to a certain place. But yeah, and all of this character stuff, all this rich character work, and I haven't even mentioned the plot yet. I mean, I think that says, and the movie's only an hour and a half. I think that says something, and the plot is great. The whole idea that there are shortages, potentially Hopper's being robbed, but they just call it shortages for the time being. and there's another big crime boss that's going to help them out and lend them $500,000, which is literally cash in a bag. Which may not be the smoothest plan, but there's no real way to trace it either. So they send Seth Green out in his plane to get it, but in kind of an ingenious bit of writing, but at the same time it's just a stroke of bad luck. But we know enough about Seth Green's character at this point that this stroke of bad luck is exactly the kind of thing that would happen to him. When he goes to the airport, they say never let go of the bag, so he never lets go of the bag, and he's going to the airport because he's got to get gas. And he's got this bag with $500,000 of mob boss money in it, and who is standing at the airport when he gets there? A dirty ass small town sheriff played by Tom Noonan. And then the whole thing, and then he tries to stash the bag and hide it, and then the fucking luggage guys, one of which is the son of Tom Noonan's dirty ass sheriff, gets a hold of it, and then the money's just switching places throughout the movie, and they have to come down to this really small town in Montana and get it back. But then when it ends up in Noonan's hands, it's like there's the whole thing where they set up the sheriff as like he's the stern dad of that one guy. There's clearly no wife here. There's the woman at the counter at the airport, and there's the moment that it's barely there, like if you blink you'll miss it, and it sets off the whole relationship between Tom Noonan and the rest of these guys and why he has an antagonism towards them. And it's when Seth Green walks up to the counter, the sheriff is in the process of asking this woman out. He's like asking her to dinner, and then Seth Green interrupts him, and then from then on the sheriff has it out for them. And then when he's the one that gets a hold of the money, we realize that he's got this, facade of being the small town sheriff that everybody knows by name, and he knows everybody in the town. But he is dirty as fuck, and he is unthreatened by everything. Like, all these mob guys come in and they say, like, hey, Dennis Hopper's my dad, and that's his money. And the sheriff does not give a fuck. He just wants the money because he thinks they're not paid enough. And he becomes the biggest threat of the movie. And it's like, that is such an awesome sort of turn of events. Just the way the story unfolds. And just the casting of Tom Noonan. Like, that's the thing, is the whole main reason this sheriff is so convincing that this is the turn of events that would happen is that it's Tom Noonan. Like, he's the kind of guy that can play both the small town sheriff, he's kind of soft-spoken, and everybody in town likes him and gets along with him, but then at the snap of your fingers, he's threatening as fuck and does not care who you are or where you come from. And then eventually we get to a point where we get a Reservoir Dogs ending.
Yeah.
Where it's an every fucking buddy dies ending. But that's the thing, is you would think, like, typically in situations like that, you would think it's a Reservoir Dogs rip-off, or, it's got lazy, so it's like, let's just kill everybody. The events perfectly align that that's what happens. Like, these are people that were made for this kind of ending. Like, there was no other way it was going to come to anything but this. And I think it's really just a perfect ending. It still manages to do the Reservoir Dogs ending, but still end on a high note, too. On an optimistic note for the protagonists, which I think is great. So, yeah, and I really think it was done dirty, because, like I said, the marketing made it look like an action movie. It's not. It's even labeled action on the spine. That is so not true. And the whole idea that it was shelved for 3 years thing, but only because the studio didn't know what to do with it. Because it was shot before Vin Diesel was a big deal and all that, and they were like, genre-wise, we don't know how to market it. So they eventually landed on, well, we'll put Vin Diesel in the marketing, now that, because they released this the year after Fast and the Furious came in. So that was their whole goal, was like, oh, we'll just make it look like an action movie with Vin Diesel.
Triple X was around then too, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think the same year. Mm-hmm. And then when very few people saw it, and the people that didn't get what they were expecting, so they went away bitterly. It's got like a 20% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is just fucking mind-boggling to me. Because I think it's really just this perfect little crime movie that just went right under the radar, but is absolutely positively worth seeing for all the stuff I mentioned. The rich character work, the little story turns.
So you essentially think its makers shot it in the foot?
Yeah, I guess it's the studio. So let's point the finger at New Line on that one.
Shocking, the studio screwed something up.
Yeah, so, yeah.
The DCEU would like a word.
Yeah, so that's my interpretation of that. That's why I think this movie is way currently underlooked. And I will bookend this by saying once again, Barry Pepper in lead roles is something we need. We need a lot of and more of. So there we go. I guess we're going on my number 5. All the rest of these are stuff I've talked about before, so we can probably get through them a little more. My number 5 is Edward Scissorhands. Which is funny, we talked about Beauty and the Beast earlier because Edward Scissorhands is basically another telling of Beauty and the Beast. And it was the year before the animated Disney movie, interestingly enough. And as we were talking about before with Big Fish, Burton has, like, Tim Burton's movies are known for being, you know, really sort of, like, gothic and dark and all that. Except for instances like Big Fish, which are occasional. Edward Scissorhands is kind of both. Kind of at the same time, because I love the opening where it's basically, it's told to us right up front that it's being told to us as a tale, like as a bedtime story, which is a perfect setup. And then this whole opening of Diane Wiest finding him, and it's like when we first see Edward, he's genuinely scary. Like the score, the Elfman score, and he's coming out of the corner, we don't know exactly what he is or what he's doing here, we're as in the dark as she is. But then the second we hear his voice, and we see like how like meek he is, and how misunderstood he is, and how he doesn't know what's really going on either, he just immediately, this is the brilliance of what Depp does in the movie too, is he goes from scary to the most sympathetic thing you've ever seen with one line where he just says, "Don't go." And it's like, that's it. He's sudden, and then we get it. We get why Diane Wiest's immediate response is, you know what, I'm taking you home. It might seem crazy at first, and it does turn out to maybe be not such a great idea that she learns the hard way. But yeah, and then in no time...
But damn it, she's gonna try.
Yeah, and then in no time, it's a comedy. It's a fish out of water comedy for most of the movie after that. And this whole thing, we talked about the Stepford Wives earlier. It's a very Stepford-esque neighborhood. Not so much the wives, they're a whole different monster in themselves. They're more so monsters than Edward is, which is basically what the movie's telling us in a not so subtle way. Particularly Kathy Baker, which is a performance I think I love more and more the more I see this. When Elaine Jones comes over and she's trying to warn them and say, like, he's a perversion of nature. And Kathy Baker's like, he's a perversion of nature? How exciting. And the way he has to interact with characters like that, and who are just this absolute contrast of the weirdly perfect neighborhood they're in, like the whole mechanics of it, where all the husbands leave for work at the same time and they come home at the same time, and all the houses are perfect, yet you've got the mountain with the castle at the top of it at the end of the street. It's this very storybook thing that could only come to life through somebody as imaginative as Burton was, especially in the early 90s. Very early 90s. It came out in 90. It's as old as I am. And it's just perfectly cast with Depp and Winona Ryder becoming this, you know, sort of iconic couple. It's one of those cases where, by all means, you should be questioning why they fall in love, but you don't. It just happens. You just get swept up in it, and you believe every bit of it, especially between the two of them.
It helps that Anthony Michael Hall's an asshole.
Yeah, and so against type in this role. It is so bizarre how close this is to like 16 Candles in time, and then he's playing a part like this that's like the total opposite. Like, Jim would beat the holy shit out of the nerdy kid in 16 Candles, or maybe even Rusty Griswold for that matter. And then Diane Wiest and Alan Arkin especially is amazing in this.
You can't buy the necessities of life with cookies.
You can't buy a car with cookies, am I right, Jim? I so love the end. Here, Bill is so oblivious when he's on the roof putting on the fake snow for Christmas, and Jim is, you know, pushing Edward away, and you can hear Jim clear as day screaming, "Get out of here!" But Bill looks off the roof and sees Edward going away, and he's like, "Hey, Ed, where are you going?"
I believe it's the last thing he says to him. pretty sure.
But then that ending also is so tragic because we see Edward put in all these situations where he's locked in Jim's house, where he's arrested. I really love the addition of the concerned cop. The one that initially arrests him, the one that almost shoots him, but then when he's in the court and he realizes what's going on, he goes up to him and he's like, you know, take care of yourself out there. And he's the one that basically escorts him back to the castle to make sure the housewives don't eat him alive on the way there. Mm-hmm. But then when he does go off, though, like when Jim kind of pushes him to get angry and like destroy the curtains and the bathroom walls, he becomes scary again. Even after all the sympathy we feel for him, and we still do after that. Mm-hmm. Especially when the romanticism really takes over, when we get one of the most heartbreaking romantic lines in movie history, when Kim says "hold me" and he says "I can't."
Yeah.
And then she makes it happen. Mm-hmm. Even despite him cutting her by accident and all that. And somebody I didn't mention in the cast, Vincent Price, as the inventor, which is, to my understanding, the relationship between Burton and Price shortly after making this movie is pretty much where he got the inspiration to portray the relationship between Ed Wood and Bela Lugosi in Ed Wood, like 4 years later, like to an extent. And then, of course, the whole, like, the production design of, like, the neighborhood and the bushes and all that.
It's a very interesting looking neighborhood.
Yeah, and then you've got, like, like I said, the whole storybook quality. Like, the bank is literally just a big white building with just small letters that just say bank. Mm-hmm. That's all it is.
It's kind of, like, the way the shots are done, it's kind of, well, I guess you can't say it's like this. You'd have to say the other things like it. It's kind of like the way Spectre shot in Big Fish.
Yeah. And then the Elfman score is probably one of the best. I didn't mention this before. I think there's only one movie score that bests Elfman's Edward Scissorhands score, and that would be Zimmer's Lion King score. I know there's plenty of great ones up there, Gone with the Wind, The Thin Red Line, and stuff like that, but those are the two that have always stuck out to me, and both just happen to be...
I'll talk about a good score here in a couple minutes.
Yeah,
a couple good scores, actually.
And then, of course, the tragedy of the inventor's death, and we truly finally see the full story of where Edward came from, and it all comes full circle. And then we get the very bittersweet ending, where he basically invents Snow, but they're apart for the rest of their lives. But she like carries on his story as like a bedtime story, and it's when you and you can kind of tell at the beginning, but when you really come to the realization that it's like Kim as an old woman is the grandma at the beginning. So yeah.
Am I the only one that wonders what happened to the inventor's bond?
It's probably best to not worry about it. It's in the cookies.
It's in the cookies.
All right, so it's are we ready for your top 5?
Yeah, my top 5. Okay, so number 5, which true to form to the rest of these movies, is one that I think everybody and their brother has seen. Number 5 for me is Forrest Gump.
It's the new Blu-ray they just put out for the anniversary. Which we just saw this in theaters in June.
Yeah.
For the first time.
Yeah. What is there really that you could say about Forrest Gump? I mean, it's very, it's funny, when we were talking about Big Fish, Big Fish's back cover said, "This is the new Wizard of Oz." I feel like Big Fish is closer to this.
Yeah.
Because Forrest goes through all these different, historical events that happened, and how he's inserted into them are just hilarious. The different, like when they're trying to integrate the University of Alabama and the whole Coons thing.
The way they insert him into the actual footage.
Yeah,
it's worth noting this movie, of all movies, won the Oscar for visual effects.
Yeah, which is deserving so.
Obviously among picture, director, actor, editing, screenplay.
He's the one that reported Watergate. He invested in Apple and became a what do you call it, a gazillionaire?
Yeah.
It's just a nice little story about a guy that, doesn't... He's kind of like... he's kind of like a tame version of Carl from Sling Blade.
Yeah.
Like, he's not really grasping what's going on, but he's grasping enough that he's getting by.
Yeah. And he knows, like, what's really important.
Yeah. Even though, you know, through the whole movie, you're like, why do you stick with Jenny? She's obviously shitty to you. But for him, it's a comfort thing. She was the one that was the first one that let him sit on the bus beside her, and it stuck all the way out until the very end. Performances in this movie are excellent. Sally Field's great. Robin Wright is great. I feel like Gary Sinise is your standout as far as your supports.
Yeah, when we came out of it, because when I did the verses with this in Castaway, I talked about our Gary Sinise experience and how he was like one of the most gracious human beings either one of us has ever met.
Yeah, Gary Sinise does really great work. If you've never checked it out, check out his work. He's a great dude that's out there fighting for a great cause. You know, definitely look into it and help him out. He's out there fighting a good fight for people.
And just us as two guys that asked for a picture, he spent way more time with us than he needed to.
With you the whole time, just wanting to shout the name Jimmy Shaker at him.
Or reindeer games. Yeah. It's like I suddenly understood the people that don't know how to function around people, especially somebody is like, with on top of all the work we've seen of his, but the charity work also just makes him this really big figure. And he's so modest about it too. Yeah,
he's a very, very wonderful human being.
And then when we came out of the theater seeing it back in June, we were talking about, like, half the ride home we were talking about how all the characters are great, and obviously, you know, the character of Forrest Gump is this icon. But Lieutenant Dan has so many different arcs. Like, he has so many different characters in one because he goes through so much every different time he's introduced back into the movie.
He goes through so many arcs, he looks like a Happy Meal box by the end of it. And there's just so many things he has to overcome, and each arc that he overcomes, you just feel more and more strongly for him. Like, you have the the Vietnam arc where he was supposed to die on the field, and he has to come to terms with the fact that he's not going to. And now he's crippled, so now he has to get over the character arc of being crippled and realize that life doesn't suck for him. And he's got something to live for. And then when you get to the end and you see him with his new legs, and he has, a female companion, and he's there at his buddy's wedding, and it's just like, it's such a far cry from where we first saw Lieutenant Dan.
The race of his fiancée is also incredibly significant.
Yeah, she's Vietnamese, which is what he ended up fighting. But it's just amazing. Like, it's his last scene at Forrest's wedding is very powerful, and there's not a lot of lines spoken. There's not like this big discussion of dialogue. It's a lot of like understood looks.
Yeah, and just, hey, I heard about you.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Yeah, that's essentially what it is. I think Jenny speaks more than anybody. But it's cool. It feels like a very genuine friendship. Which a lot of Forrest's friendships in the movie are one-sided. I would say besides that, him and Bubba was probably the most equal.
Yeah, I was telling you, also this past time when we watched it in theaters, is the more I watch it, the more I get an appreciation for his friendship with Bubba and just how much it means. And how, like we used to, like, the scene when he just says, hey, why don't you put your back against mine, I'll put my back against yours so we don't have to sleep with our heads in the mud. It's like, we see the movie so many times, that's just a line that goes by, but then it's like when you really realize just how close they were and how much that, like, really shows that. And then it's like, the more you come to terms with that, the harder Bubba's death is. And Forrest's, like, that whole half of him is gone for the rest of the time that he's in the, Army. So, yeah. And
Forrest, even, like, with his lack of understanding for a lot of things, even he says that if he had known it was the last time they were going to talk, he would have thought of something better to say. And the fact that Forrest knows that the last thing he said to Bubba wasn't what he wanted it to be.
It's incredible how the movie's known for being as funny as it is, without being too offensive.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like so overwhelmingly tragic so many times throughout.
Yeah, it really
Like
is.
I was talking about with the Lion King, how the scene, "Can You Feel Love Tonight" scene was kind of my first experience with like knowing what romanticism was and what it felt like. Forrest Gump is a movie where when I started seeing it at a young age is when it was like the concept of death was really taking over and really terrifying me. So that's always been really significant to me also. But like I said, the fact that it's able to balance that tone-wise is like insane.
It's just a very, very good movie.
And that's not even to mention it has a love story.
It holds up incredibly well for being, what is it, 25 years this year?
Yeah, and the relationship between his mom also. I've always been really touched by the lines he says twice in two very different contexts about how his mom has a way of saying things so that he can understand them.
Yeah.
And it's like he's saying it just about things in general when he's a kid, and then he says it again, I think, about her death.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that's just such a yeah.
And the fact that, you know, at the end at Jenny's grave, he's struggling with what he wants to believe. You know, it's, you know, when he first grew up, it was, you know, his mom was his best friend. His mom told him everything. Everything that Mama said was important. Kind of like a serious version of The Waterboy or a more lighthearted version of Norman Bates. But at the end, you know, he's allowed his experience of the world to come in. And Lieutenant Dan's theory holds as much weight as his mom's.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing for him to be able to do that. It just shows kind of how he kind of got attached to Lieutenant Dan and how their relationship kind of bloomed from there. So on to my number 4, right? So my number 4 is the most current movie on this list. It's not very old. It's less than 10 years old.
10 years this year.
10 years this year. Okay.
Actually, 10 years last month.
Oh, okay. But we'll go ahead and we'll dive into it. My number 4 movie is Inglourious Basterds. This movie was one of those that as soon as I watched it, I knew that I liked it. And I knew I liked it a lot.
I was there. We were in the smallest auditorium our theater has, and it was packed.
Mm-hmm. And the reason that this movie works as well as it does 100% falls on Christoph Waltz's shoulders. Sorry, I'm so tired. Christoph Waltz's shoulders. To me, Christoph Waltz in this movie is right up there with one of the greatest villain performances of all time. He is so calculating and so seedy. And I was thinking about this earlier today when I was trying to think what I was going to say about this movie. Landa spends the entire movie until the last 5 minutes coming out on top of every situation he's in. Every single one, he comes out with the upper hand.
Which is what makes his last scene so satisfying.
Yes, he finally gets his comeuppance. The only scene that you could argue that he didn't get a one-up was when Shoshana tricked him at the restaurant and he wasn't able to see through it. But I've always thought that he did. Just the way that he approached it, he was like, but he wasn't going to make a scene. And he never really he was never going to be able to justify acting on that. But I think he knew. And I didn't know this until I did a little bit of research, but it's all in the ordering of the cream. Because I guess the cream back in the 40s was made from animal lard. And as a Jewish person, you couldn't consume animal lard. So that's why he insisted on the whipped cream and pushed for it. And that way when it came out, he was going to look to see if she ate it. Which she did. But you remember he was just like, wait for the cream, don't do it, and everything. And then what does he do? He smokes half a cigarette and just sticks it right in the cream. What an asshole.
And talking about that, when you talk about Wait for the Cream, that's one of those cases where we talk about the brilliance of Tarantino dialogue. And what I always thought was interesting about this movie was, and I've talked about this with a lot of people, and they all see it the same way. And that is the fact that when you see this movie enough times, even though it's mostly in, like, there's a lot of French with subtitles, or German with subtitles, either one. When I remember the lines in this movie, I hear them in my head in English. Because the dialogue is so in tune with the way it's delivered through the other languages. It's just kind of translated itself in my mind at this point. Because it just flows so well.
And it's funny, anytime that English is used, the fact that English is used actually kind of plays into the plot.
Yeah.
Like at La Petite, or Senor La...
Monsieur
La Petite, thank you.
He's French.
Thank you, Monsieur La Petite. They use English because he knows that the Jews under the floorboards can't understand it. So he lays out his whole plan in English, and then just switches back to French. In the tavern scene, when they start speaking English, it's because Hickox was found out. There was no point in speaking a foreign language at that point. Which the whole tavern scene is like a master class in building suspense for something bad that's going to happen. Because the whole tavern scene, like, even if you've never seen the movie, you just get this sense of something's going to go wrong.
There's usually always that scene in a Tarantino movie where it's like one long, unbroken scene, usually right in the center of the movie. And it's like I've said many times before, he's the master of, like, you could cut to another scene or anything like that, or another room or something, but he never leaves that area until the whole scene comes to its explosive ending. There's a very great scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood where you'll get that vibe also.
Yeah, obviously this one is my favorite of his movies. I don't care that he took historical liberties with it. It's a hell of a lot of fun.
I don't think most do.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's like one of the few people that can, like, totally get away with it.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot more satisfying. What sounds more satisfying? Hitler blew himself up at a movie theater. Hitler got blown away by a couple of Jews in the movie theater that was exploding with all the Nazis inside burning. With Goebbels and Herman and everybody. Much more satisfying ending the way Tarantino did it.
Sylvester Growth as Goebbels in this is gold.
Oh my god. Yeah, he is. He really is. He's fantastic.
Like, whenever I hear, regardless of history and all the history that's passed, whenever somebody says the name Goebbels now, I see him specifically.
Yeah.
Rather than the real person.
And sadly enough, I see him putting it in Julie Dreyfus's ass. Making those weird ass noises.
Yeah, the way he basically plays all of them up as, like, parodies too, just really drives the point home.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the movie's really fun. One of the greatest villains ever, got an Oscar for it, fully deserved it. Brad Pitt's a lot of fun, Diane Kruger's really good. The cast in this is really, really good, really strong.
Yeah, when Brad Pitt's, like, the afterthought, I think that says something about the rest of the cast.
Yeah, and it's just...
Daniel Bruhl. August Deal's a huge standout. I love him so much in this.
That's Hellstrom, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's really good too. Especially in the beginning scene where he's taking her to the restaurant, it seems like that he's caught her and he's just an asshole.
Till Schweiger.
Oh god. Hugo Stiglitz' little guitar riff.
Yeah, watching Till Schweiger and August Deal in the tavern scene, I love that moment when Stiglitz is getting ready to take a drink, when they all do, but he just pauses and stares down Hellstrom without Hellstrom ever seeing him.
Yeah. Yeah. Till Schweiger's great in that scene. But yeah, great movie, a lot of fun. Definitely check it out. It's funny, it's dramatic, it's intense.
Violent as fuck.
Yeah, but it's a good time. It's a very, very good time.
Alright, speaking of violent as fuck.
Brad Pitt.
Yes, producer-wise. My number 4 is another case of, might seem like an odd choice for this director, because there are so many options, most of which I've talked about before, and I've talked about at great length about how masterful they are. So, and I totally understand if there are some raised eyebrows in regards to, especially at the number 4 spot, which it has been at for quite some time, pretty much since it was released 13 years ago. That, like, of all the options I have for this director, why this is the one I consider to be on the top. We're talking about Scorsese, and my number 4 is The Departed. And I know it seems like almost sacrilege to, if I'm going to go with a Scorsese, why I would not go with Goodfellas, or Casino, or Taxi Driver, or Raging Bull, or pretty much any other thing on his filmography. The movie that got him his Oscar and the movie that got a Best Picture winner under his belt, I think are totally different, because a lot of people immediately when you say that, they're like, The Departed was an underwhelming choice for that to be his Oscar success. But you witnessed this firsthand. This was yet again another case of love at first sight. There was just something about this movie that clicked with me so instantly. The first thing I actually want to bring up is I had seen Infernal Affairs before I saw this movie. So there should have been no surprises whatsoever. All the way down to the elevator headshot is also in Infernal Affairs. But I just completely, and I knew it was a remake of Infernal Affairs, but I never really thought about Infernal Affairs the first time I saw this movie, because it just took me in its own particular way. And the fact that it's pretty much the perfect example of adaptation, because this movie is 2.5 hours, Infernal Affairs is about 1 hour 40. But all the story beats are there in both movies. But there's just, what Monahan did with the characters in this movie just took it so above and beyond and added so many different sort of flavors to it. And it Scorsese definitely turned it into a Scorsese movie, for sure. And just the way, this whole starting point and the whole setup itself, where it's two guys who basically unknowingly have to become each other. It's face-off without surgery. In a gritty Scorsese cop versus crime world. Sometimes those two things becoming one and the same, or many times becoming one and the same. And there's just so many rich characters and so many things added that we get all the way down to the nitty-gritty of it. All the way down to little details like French's wife. Scenes that are like establish an entire character's backstory with one shot that's a fraction of a second of a dude strangling somebody. And it's like we know everything about French's backstory in a fraction of a second. We know that Fitzy's mom is straight out of Going My Way. This goes as deep into character as you can possibly get in 2.5 hours. Like, can you imagine if this was like a mini-series or something? How far we could have gone and all the different characters that could have brought this to life in really big ways. And it's just endless. And then we get the stuff like Queenan and the way that he's almost sort of fatherly to Billy after a while. And not so much to the supposed good cop in Colin. You can sense like the distance between Colin and everybody else, even though he's supposed to be totally and completely blending in. And you talk about Nicholson and how over the top he is, which is great. A lot of people think maybe he's too cartoonish. I think he's just the right amount of cartoonish. And I love the fact that he's playing like the aging gangster, and it's like you would think, oh, he's getting older, which means he's losing his touch or whatever. But with age, Frank Costello's getting crazier. Like the whole, he's got blood on his hands, I don't know what the fuck he's gonna do, and he's freaking Billy out with every new thing. But the real villain of this movie is Colin, Matt Damon. Because he's just so sort of slimy to his core in the way that's not particularly over the top. But like the more he deceives and the more he goes down that rabbit hole, the more despicable he becomes. And the more sort of sympathetic Billy comes when he goes the same direction down the crime path, because we know it's just making him a miserable person. He's popping his pills with Sprite and shit, doing all that stuff. And then there's the case of Madeline, which might seem like a more or less pointless character, but the fact that these two have their missions are on each side of each other, and they are enemies all the way down to the girl, I think is a really interesting touch to throw in there. And yet they don't even know, they barely know the other exists. The only time they meet in the movie before the phone call is when they pass each other on their way in and out of Queenan's office.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even really see each other. I think Billy like looks away for a fraction of a second, doesn't even see Colin walk by him.
Mm-hmm.
And Colin's looking ahead at the secretary he's trying to hit on or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the whole thing with Colin's sexuality we won't even get into. That's a whole can of worms in itself. All that stuff. So, yeah, it's just so many damn layers they added to a story that was already amazing in Infernal Affairs. I don't want to take anything away from Infernal Affairs, but I feel like Monahan's script just added so much to it that it just enriched it so much more. I even like the whole side thing with Jimmy Pappas. There's like a whole thing that goes on there, but it's all wrapped up so quickly. It's that perfect sort of Shoemaker editing, where we get this whole thing about, there's the guys from, what is it, Jersey. They're going to come after Billy, but then they decide...
Providence,
that's it. And then it's like, oh, we'll just take them out, and we'll blame it on Jimmy Pappas. Jimmy Pappas gets arrested, he goes to jail, he has a heart attack, and then gets knifed in a hospital. Problem solved. And it's like, that's like a whole series of events that's like 10 seconds of dialogue. And just stuff like that is just really brings this movie to life. And then there's touches like the scene where it's revealed that Costello's an FBI informant. And that guy's watching the movie on TV where Victor McLaglen's saying, "Frankie, your mother forgives me," is the end of the movie, The Informant. And so it's, yeah, like, and that's, yeah, so, and all those references like that. There's a Psycho reference in this when Colin turns the shower on, just because. And then just as the movie goes on, the way they close in on each other, and then they eventually meet, and we get our climax that basically, Reservoir Dogs was kind of the ultimate everybody dies movie, and then The Departed kind of took that title. Like, whenever you see a movie where everybody dies, people call it Departed Syndrome now instead of Reservoir Dogs. And then it kind of became its own thing, and so, yeah, so I was always completely and totally taken by this. It is the Scorsese movie. Oddly enough, I understand, because you know from previous videos, if you've seen them, how much I love Goodfellas and Casino and Taxi Driver. But for some reason, this is the one that I just personally gravitate towards the most. And it's kind of always been that way, ever since I saw it for the first time. From that amazing 20-minute opening, all the way through all the stuff I just mentioned, I just think it's absolutely perfect.
the under his wing shot.
Yeah. So, all that stuff. The grabbing Colin as a kid thing and all that. And that's the thing, too, is I was saying, I think the last time I talked about this, Billy's death scene and how it catches people off guard, not just because he's the main character, not just because he's DiCaprio, not just because of how abrupt it is. We know Billy all the way back through his childhood because of what Dignam's telling him at the beginning. And it's like, we know every single thing about him. We watched him watch his mother die, then go through the aftermath with his piece of shit uncle or whatever. And it's like that we saw that character die so abruptly, that we knew so much about personally, all the way from his childhood to his personal tragedies and everything that led up to this point. That he had gone through being an undercover cop, having gone to prison, you know, Kevin Corrigan.
Staying in Kevin Corrigan's house.
Just all that. And yeah, so it's just, to me, just a really brutal-ass, hard-hitting movie from beginning to end. And the use of Chevron of the Boston is, like, perfection. So, alright. So where are we now?
Number 3.
I'm going to number 3.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. My number 3 is another movie I've talked about before. And I think I mentioned in that video that it was one of my all-time favorite movies, like top 5. And that is still the case. Yet another case of, it might seem odd, of all the movies this director put out, this is the one that's here. In this case, we're talking about Kubrick, and we're talking about Full Metal Jacket. Yes, over 2001, and A Clockwork Orange, and Doctor Strangelove, and so Barry Lyndon.
Fun fact, this almost wasn't Kubrick's first appearance. The movie that Pirates of the Caribbean knocked out in mine was actually The Shining.
Yeah, which I'm really surprised got bumped.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about this before I was comparing it to Platoon, which kind of gave it a totally different context. So here I kind of just want to talk about it in the sense of, like, just as a movie and as this Kubrick creation and the way he does it. So the whole boot camp segment, the first 45 minutes, is obviously the most famous and beloved portion of the movie. Which to me is just 45 minutes. Yeah, you know, they quote the R. Lee Ermey lines, and it is this really, you know, sort of funny thing and all that. But he's intent. But it's also funny because we can, you know, acknowledge how intimidating he is. But we're comfortable from a distance, being in, you know, a living room or a movie theater or whatever, watching this and not right up in it, so we can laugh at the things he's saying. And while that is the case for me as well, I also think the entire first 45 minutes, the whole boot camp segment, is 45 minutes of complete and total pure anxiety. Just completely. And you can take that from anybody's perspective, from Joker's perspective, trying to get Leonard in line, but it's just not working. He's just not registering. This is just not his environment. He's just really in the wrong place. And this is just going to cause a whole series of events that's going to go horribly wrong. The guilt he has to feel of being the one that's most bitter about the fact that he just refuses to succeed, by the way that he just beats him senseless with the soap when everybody else just took one hit. But then he guiltily has to cover his ears while he cries out in pain for the night. And basically almost like he has to accept it as his own failure when Leonard finally snaps, because it was his job to keep him in line. Which disappears entirely by the time he has to get to Vietnam, because there's such a change in the whole environment here. And I know a lot of people don't care for the second half near as much as they do the first half, but as I have stated tirelessly many, many times, I will defend the second half of Full Metal Jacket to the death. I think it is just as good, and the whole thing works as a whole, with us getting one side of it and then the other. We also talked about this again when a couple of comments were left on the video I did before, where a lot of good points were addressed there as well. And I do think that Kubrick is like really the perfect choice for a war movie. And the main reason I say that is that, talking about many of those scenes with, like, when we're introduced to Animal Mother and his guys, and some of the disturbing shit they do, like the birthday party with the dead guy. And the thing that Kubrick is able to do that makes him perfect for a war movie is he can show us really, really disturbing images that we just can't seem to take our eyes off of when you look at stuff like, you know, A Clockwork Orange, or The Shining, or Eyes Wide Shut. And the thing about that is he will show us really disturbing imagery, yet we always come back for more. We always go back to those movies. People can find the first few scenes of A Clockwork Orange extremely disturbing, but how many times have people seen those scenes over and over again because it's a movie they keep going back to? And the way that Kubrick is able to show stuff like that kind of makes him perfect for showing some of the real nitty-gritty of what they're showing in the Vietnam scenes of this, and the pure insanity that a lot of the people have gone to at that point. And then the way it also kind of captures the war in general, like through the camera, where like there's a lot of cases with the camera's like crouched down, like it's taking cover as we follow them. But then there's also some of the stuff that's not as intense. Like, they were able to make iconic scenes out of this movie by having Matthew Modine negotiate with prostitutes. It's like, how do you make an iconic scene out of that in a Vietnam movie? Kubrick can do that. And then we have scenes that are like genuinely human, like when we see Joker and Cowboy reunite, and it feels like a genuine human moment when they find each other again. But then we're like right back into the show after all of that. And then it gets intense all over again, like I said, with the introduction of characters like Animal Mother, where like we talked about before with like the comments and before, where people have suggested that Animal Mother is pretty much what Pyle would have been if he had made it to Vietnam. which I always thought was a really interesting theory. And then we get this ending with the sniper, which I think just kind of, by putting, like, we kind of go from moment to moment throughout the movie, basically like it would be. But then remembering that we are not just a movie, but a Stanley Kubrick movie, I like the idea of the climax being this sniper, because of there being like this one particular specific enemy for the climax of the movie feels cinematic in this really big way, and it really kind of brings the movie to a clean close. That we have this last thing, and then it kind of brings Joker full circle of, number one, it's the duality of man, the born to kill, but also the peace sign. But then he's the one that has to do the kill. But then there's also the scene in the helicopter when they're kind of first coming in, and he's talking to the guy about how how can you kill women and children? And of course, to kill the sniper, it's revealed he's got to kill a woman to do that. And it just kind of all comes together in this nice little bow, and then takes us into an ending that feels like open-ended, but at the same time, like, enough of a close. And so, like, as far as, war movie goes, accuracy or no accuracy or whatever, just as a movie standpoint, I just find it to be perfect, like, perfectly executed, perfectly put together, all that stuff. So, the performances, all that, just comes together in this perfect package, both the first half and the second. So, that's how I feel about that.
Okay.
I think we're back to you, aren't we?
Yeah. Alright, so we're up to number 3 on the list. Number 3 is a movie that we talked about extensively before, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But the number 3 movie is Tim Burton's Batman. It's my favorite iteration of the character. I still, to this day, think Michael Keaton is the best Batman around, all around. His Bruce Wayne leaves a lot to be desired, but at the same time, unfortunately for Keaton, his movies weren't set up to have a lot of Bruce Wayne going on, like Bale's did, or even another one like Val Kilmer.
I find that interesting. He's like the opposite of what you said about Bale in regards to their Batman and Bruce Wayne.
But his Batman is able to be intimidating without having to, send his voice into overdrive.
He's practically whispering.
And he's just very intimidating by just standing there. His suit is my favorite. Elfman's score is fantastic. It fits the movie really well, the way it kind of broods and kind of picks up here and there. The movie itself, like The Dark Knight, has a haphazard Joker plan that we make work. We do get some backstory on the Joker, which does kind of take away from the movie as far as a comic standpoint, because the comics doesn't really ever give you an origin. However, I don't think it makes the movie dead in the water by any stretch. Nicholson just has so much fun with it. A lot of people tell me, they're like, well, don't you think Heath Ledger's better than Jack? Well, it's two different Jokers, which you and I will dive into a little bit more in a few weeks, as far as that subject goes, so stay tuned for that. But as far as the movie itself, like I said, I enjoy it. It's my favorite comic book movie of all time. It's dark, it's gritty, I love, what's going on with it. I think it's very atmospheric. Gotham City does feel like it's its own little place. All this shit's going down. I think the movie builds to a nice climax. I love the little tidbit that it actually takes us 10 actual minutes to get to the climax, based on what the Joker says in Milwaukee. Robert Wuhl is a treasure in this film. Robert Wuhl is a treasure in general, and it's a shame that we don't see him on our screens more. But yeah, for this movie, not much else to say. We talked about it in detail before. It still holds up as my favorite comic book movie of all time, and Keaton is my favorite Batman, and I think it's just a great comic book movie. I think without this movie, we would not be where we were today. Because people just didn't take comic books movies seriously until this came out. And this came out and it was different. It was dark. It was brooding. It's definitely for adults. As a child, Actually, as a younger child, I actually preferred Returns to this one. But as I got older, I started leaning more towards this one because Returns started feeling more outlandish. I still like it, but as far as the adaptations go, this one's my favorite, and it's held its spot firmly at number 3 for some time now. So that's, to quote movie number 5. That's all I have to say about that. Anything you want to add?
I think I've said everything I needed to in like the last 3 videos we talked about.
Number 2 is another movie that we talked about. This one I just rewatched the other day, and holy shit, it holds up. Number 2 for me is the very first Back to the Future. I love the style of it. I love the adventurous feel to it. I think the score really helps drive that home, as far as the sense of adventure. I love all the little callbacks that happen in the movie. Like all the different lines that you hear at the beginning that are later used. Like, Marty saying he doesn't know if he could take that kind of rejection. Biff with his lines.
Watching
the homework thing. Huh?
Watching the honeymooners.
Yeah.
Or at the beginning, and then again with Lorraine's family.
Yeah, and George's laugh is the most amazing thing ever. Crispin Glover in this movie is really, really good. He might be the performance of the movie for me.
Yeah.
Because he's really good at playing kind of timid and
pathetic.
Yeah, which mostly anymore he plays characters that are weird and pathetic, but not really timid. This isn't Willard that you got going on here. But it's a fantastic movie. There's a reason that it's still referenced, today. The DeLorean is iconic. There's a lot of iconic things going on. The Watchtower is iconic. Christopher Lloyd himself is iconic. You see it pop up on a lot of movies, or on a lot of lists that people have put of movies that should never be remade. And I can see why, although I like our idea that if it was ever going to be remade, get me Jeff Bridges as Doc Brown, please. But outside of that, not much else to say. We did the whole trilogy. That's where you reminded me that part 3 is the gift that keeps on giving, with the bar scene. But otherwise, still holds up. Still a lot of fun, a lot of action. Spielberg's name's on it. Zemeckis, director of Forrest Gump, directs it. And it's masterful. It's a great adventure movie, just a great story with a simple premise, and it's tons of fun.
Alright, my number 2 might seem a bit obvious. Sort of in line with The Lion King. It's a movie that I just grew up knowing from beginning to end. Also a musical. Very simple choice. It's The Wizard of Oz. This is a movie, obviously, not only that everybody knows, but it's also just kind of like, sort of like the ultimate musical, I guess you could say, where there are no wasted songs. I think everybody knows just about every word to every song, which you could say about The Lion King or Rocky or other musicals we mentioned. Mm-hmm. But to the point that the songs flow so well through the characters and the story, and I guess it's because I just know the movie so well at this point, it just almost doesn't even register me as a musical. Like when people say, like, what's your favorite musical, and it's like, well, I suppose there's like Moulin Rouge, and there's like Mary Poppins, or whatever, and it's like, it just passes by me, because I just don't even register it as, like, specifically a musical, even though that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's music pretty much to the whole thing.
And the thing about that, it also is having Judy Garland, who is perfect as Dorothy, because you kind of get a sense that, like, because it seemed odd at the time because she was older when Dorothy's supposed to be like a child, but Judy Garland kind of had this perfect sense of, like, almost like, I mean, obviously not to go too much into her real life and how depressing that was, that she kind of has this vibe about her that she's seen shit. So like when she's, you know, really looking for another world or another side to go to, and when she feels kind of abandoned by everything around her, you really, really feel that in a way that you couldn't have with like maybe a Shirley Temple type, where it would have been much more of just like Shirley Temple did do a movie that was considered a Wizard of Oz knockoff called The Blue Bird. That movie in itself is pretty incredible, but you can tell also that it's kind of a ripoff of this. And it was a movie that kind of just sort of went by the wayside for a lot of people. And it was like, it's another Shirley Temple movie, the end. And that's probably, possibly what would have happened to this if it wasn't Judy Garland. And if it was somebody a bit more of the Shirley Temple type, if not Shirley Temple herself.
Plus, I think you would have just looked at it and just seen Shirley Temple. You would have seen Dorothy.
Yeah. And then, talking about that, you got the cast that really also brings this to life. Ray Balger, Jack Haley, Burt Lahr, especially Margaret Hamilton, in probably the best supporting actress performance of all time. And of course Frank Morgan as the Wizard and Professor Marvel and just about everybody else they run into at Oz, in Oz. Jack Haley in particular has always really stood out to me. Ray Balger also, particularly with the physical comedy, but there's something so appropriately heartbreaking about the Tin Man. He has one of the most heartbreaking lines in cinema history with, "Now I know I got a heart because it's breaking." That line just murders me every single time. And yeah, and the way it's set up, like it almost like maybe would look cheap by the standards of say Gone with the Wind, which was the same year. Where it's like you can see the paintings and all that, but it's like the fact that it kind of has that old Hollywood feel to it, and like the way it's set up and all that, I think has a lot to do with the appeal of it. Where it does feel like not just a classic MGM musical, but there's a little something more in there that made it as iconic as it is, more so than many of the other musicals that they put out when that was their thing. And then, of course, and talking about it coming out the same year as Gone with the Wind, it had a whole lot of different directors. Because the credited director is Victor Fleming, but before him they had George Cukor, who would go on to do stuff like My Fair Lady. And then after Victor Fleming, they had stuff like, I think the Munchkinland scenes and some other stuff was done by King Vidor. And all three of these directors are in like the fucking Hall of Fame. So it's like you can see, in any other case you would think a whole bunch of different directors doing a whole bunch of different scenes, it's like, oh, this is going to be a mess. But this just managed to come together in like the most perfect way, and it's seamless too when it goes from each scene to the next. And also just the whole thing of just showing how, I mean, yeah, Gone with the Wind was the giant 4-hour epic in grand color and all that, but this movie kind of really showed the difference in the gloriousness and how you can handle, like, what makes black and white so good and what makes color so good at the same time, and the way it transitions from one to the other. And yeah, and it's a movie that just kind of still works every single time. Like all the way down to the last very famous line. Every line in this movie is a famous line, obviously. But yeah, and the emotional beats and all that stuff, all the songs, everything hits just as well as it ever has. And we're in the late stages of 2019. I don't know how much more impressive you can get. And the thing about this also, and this might seem maybe a bit odd, but speaking absolutely truthfully, this movie is so iconic and just everybody grew up with it. There are some people out there. I honestly don't know. If I were to meet somebody that didn't grow up with this and doesn't know this movie as well as most people do, I would feel a distance with that person no matter what. Like, I'd almost feel like I couldn't fully connect with that person if they didn't grow up knowing this movie front to back. Because it's just kind of a foreign concept to me. That could happen to some poor person's childhood. So, yes. So, that's... Anything else I would have mentioned, I mentioned this was the very first verses I ever did. So, it'll be in there. So, am I doing my number one?
Whichever one.
I think that's where we are. So my number one isn't going to surprise anybody. So there's no need for fanfare or build up.
Same.
Or
Let's just stick them both up here.
All right. Is anybody surprised? What the hell was that? Mine has a Jackrabbit Slims menu. What does yours have?
The chapter list.
Oh, that's good. All right. Am I going first?
Yeah.
Alright, well, obviously it's been established that Tarantino is my favorite living writer and director, probably maybe even living or dead, as he just continues to make greatness as he goes on. But Pulp Fiction in particular, and it might seem like a very sort of film school 101 choice, and I get that to an extent, but as many people have said about this movie, it sort of changed the way I looked at movies, just kind of in general. And how it was a movie that was released and turned a director into, like, it's one thing for a director to make a movie at a young age and then just really take off and the movie becomes popular. Tarantino made this movie and his name became a genre. Like, he himself made his own genre that's just his name. Which is why movies like The Boondock Saints come out and people say it's Tarantino-esque or whatever the hell. And that's something that just does not come along often at all whatsoever. And the way dialogue is, how it basically was one of the main teachers of dialogue doesn't have to be expositional. People, you don't have to constantly have to be doing something. The dialogue can just be people being people no matter what they're doing. If it's two dudes on their way to kill some college kids, they can talk about fast food or whatever the hell, or foot massages. They can do any of that. Yet somehow, some way, this dialogue, it serves that purpose, but the dialogue also always comes back every time. Like, when they're talking about the Royale with cheese, it's like, oh, they're just shooting the shit because, Vincent just got back from Amsterdam. But
I also love the fact that they're two hitmen, and essentially part of their conversation boils down to just work gossip.
Yeah.
Like anybody who work in an office or anything like that.
But the thing about that, like the Tony Rocky horror thing, and the Royale with cheese thing, and the foot massage thing, it all comes back in a different way. Because, like I said, when they talk about it the first time, it's just work gossip. When they talk about it again, it's Mia revealing something about her and Marcellus's relationship and whether or not it's true, which kind of shows us whether or not Marcellus is as threatening as he may or may not seem. And then there is the Royale with cheese thing where it's like, this is what they talk about. And that's really interesting because it's just like two dudes. Mm-hmm. But then that same dialogue somehow becomes very threatening when he's saying it to Brett later on, and it's like the way that scene is building and the tension of it, and we can sense it's going in that direction. It's like it serves its purpose of just them shooting the shit, but it does inevitably have a purpose of sorts, but it's not necessarily in the expositional sense. He's using dialogue in a way people didn't realize you could, and it's insane and unprecedented as far as this point. I think, anyway. And then you get some of the stuff that people bitch about, like the whole, everything with Fabian and the Gold Watch segment, which is always fine by me because I think Maria de Medeiros is amazing in this, quite honestly. And she's really kind of that ultimate contrast to Bush and kind of shows that side of him. That it's like, we know that he killed a dude and he doesn't give a shit about it. And it was for his own gain. All he cares about is getting his money and running away before Marcellus kills him. But then there's like such a sensitive thing going on between he and Fabian's relationship, even though they're also so different. But then the contrast comes back when he realizes the watch is gone and he completely blows his top, and we realize, oh yeah, I forgot, this guy killed a guy and he's probably capable of killing again, especially since a crime boss is coming to kill him as we speak if he doesn't get this watch and get the fuck out. And then the whole thing, it is so appropriate that the Gold Watch segment ends with the Twilight Zone thing, because you want to talk like unpredictable. Like I remember feeling so incredibly disoriented. Like I don't even know that I cared for this the first time I saw it. because stuff like this, stuff that happens in the Gold Watch, is so disorienting at first. I mean, he walks into his own apartment, and Vincent, the main character who we got to know through this date with me and everything about him and how cool and likable he is, even though he's a fuck up heroin addict and all that.
And he's a shitty hitman.
Yeah, just blown away like nothing. And then we go on to the whole pawn shop thing, and it's like, oh, there's the crime boss that's trying to kill him, and oh, they're in a shootout, and oh, Butch goes into a pawn shop. What's going to happen here? The very fucking last thing you would guess. the Peter Green is here, who's apparently some security guard, who's into the whole rape thing. The Gimp. Bring out the Gimp. The exchange of dialogue here. Bring out the Gimp. The Gimp's asleep. Well, wake his ass up. And he's like, okay, I'm gonna go wake the Gimp up. Where's the Gimp? He's in a cage in the floor. And he speaks in squeals. How did this movie get here?
In the basement of a pawn shop.
How did this movie get here? And it's like, it's so insane and so unthinkable. And I was talking about this when I was talking about with stuff like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The glorious thing about Tarantino's movies is that he will think of this stuff. We never will. And that's the joy of watching his movies, is he will think of the shit that us as audience members never would have. And this pawn shop is like the ultimate example of that. Yet somehow the movie never loses its tone. Like the whole scene where Butch is trying to decide on the weapon he's going to use. Oh, well, he's just letting it happen. Oh, well, he's trying to decide what weapon to use. And it's like the ultimate sort of... And then it's like, if you this scene wasn't Tarantino enough, before Tarantino was really, really, really Tarantino, when he gets the fucking sword, it's his weapon of choice. And it's just so fucked up. It's so bizarre and so out there. It's even today, 25 years later, it's unlike anything you've ever seen. And it's still, no matter how many times I see this movie, which is like a fucking 100 times by this point, I still cannot get over just how insane that whole segment is. And how much of a rabbit hole it goes down. And then brings us right back to where we were with the Bonnie situation, and then ultimately to the diner. And I was talking to you on the phone about how the diner is one of my favorite scenes ever. Like, it's the scene that propelled it to being my favorite movie ever, was this, because Samuel L. Jackson in this might be my favorite performance in movie history, next to Judy Holliday in Born Yesterday or Margaret Hamilton in The Wizard of Oz. And it's that scene when he's dissecting the meaning of the Bible verse he's been saying all this time, where at first he thought it was just some, cold-blooded shit to say to a motherfucker before he popped a cap in his ass. But then it becomes this really deep thing with so many multiple meanings, and then he just sort of leaves it at that. And then Pumping and Honey Bunny just have to take that with them. Is like, I don't know that a movie has ever had a more perfect ending. And there's some stuff we skipped over. There's the relationship between Vincent and Mia, which is iconic in itself, the twist contest. Jackrabbit Slims. This place that it has so much detail to it, and is shown to us in this one long take, that so many people assume that this place was real. And this place is not real at all. But every single tiny little detail down to it makes it look like they just walked into an existing restaurant. And that's, yeah, and then like I said, the way that it's just like, of all the other things I said, and all of, like, the genuinely funny stuff that's in it, it's the tension, like the Brett scene, when we get stuff like, sometimes the camera barely cuts. There's the moment when he's drinking the Sprite, and we keep waiting for it to cut back to Brett or to Vincent or somebody, and it doesn't. We just wait for him to drink the whole thing, and that anticipation of a cut is keeping us on edge. And then he kills Flock of Seagulls like fucking nothing. And then just the way this whole scene builds, and all that. And then the whole scene with the shot is, like, considered one of the most intense scenes in movie history. And just the way all the violence, like, it's a movie that's known for being so violent and so heavy on blood and guts and all that. There's hardly any blood in it. It's all implied in the cutting and all that. And it convinced people that it's this really graphic and gruesome movie. The implication of, I'm gonna get medieval on your ass. It's all, It's just, yeah. So, and then there's stuff, like I said, talking about the unpredictable, whether it be the pawn shop or Vincent's death. Then there's Marvin's death. Once again, if the gun goes off, it's like, oh man, I shot Marvin in the face. But it's so bloody and graphic, and there's brains everywhere. It's like, people saw this scene in 1994. Some were laughing hysterically, some were horrified.
Mm-hmm.
And there was just a line right down the middle, and the fact that it can be both simultaneously is just sort of Tarantino all over. So that's the best I can probably put it into words, especially at going on 4:15 in the morning is what we've reached.
4:15 in the a.m.
Alright, so do you want to talk about Lebowski before we just talked about Lebowski too?
Yeah,
Very
Lebowski,
recently.
I'm not going to go into too much. Watch the video. Lebowski, the reason it's number one is its comedy, its story. Bridges is great. Goodman is fantastic as usual. A lot of memorable characters. A lot of memorable situations that are really funny. Like I said, we talked about it a lot, and it is 4:15 in the morning.
That video was like an hour long almost.
Yeah, so check out that video. Tells you exactly why Lebowski is, where it deserves to be. So.
Alright. Wow. It's probably the longest video I think we've done. I'm assuming we surpassed the Marvel videos time.
We're close to 4 hours.
Okay. So, that would be... Are you glad you suggested this video?
Yeah, I'm just very tired.
Yes. And we're probably not going to have voices tomorrow either.
Mm-hmm.
We're just going to go to that screening of The Shawshank Redemption, the theater, so we don't need to speak anyway. So, that's what this is. Yeah. Whatever's happening in mid-October, I'm really not sure of as of right now. We're shooting this on September 22nd.
Well, there was that one video that you and I talked about doing in the middle of October.
Yeah. No, actually, a couple.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. One of them will be keeping in with the horror theme. The horror verses will have been going on at this point. And then there's something related to a movie that came out a couple of weeks ago as you're seeing this. That we'll kind of continue a discussion on. I don't know if you had plans to see that movie or not.
Yeah, I'll see it when it comes out.
Yeah. So, yeah, so a whole bunch. October's going to be filled with shit. So, yeah. So I think if you have nothing else to add, I think we can end this. So that's it.